Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. This week we are covering part two of World War II. Last week we covered World War II. We covered the beginnings of the war through the fall of Poland, the Blitzkrieg in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, the fall of France, and we touched on the Battle of Britain. So now we are in the latter part of 1940. Germany has no way of defeating Britain because it can't cross the English Channel. Hitler went and tried to get Franco into the war so he could close Gibraltar. Italy has declared war, which after when the defeat of France was imminent, Mussolini, who had refused to join Hitler and made all these demands for supplies from Hitler if he were to join, suddenly saw he didn't want to miss his opportunity. He was going to take a chunk of France, and it turns out he had his own designs. And so now, in the latter part of 1940, we should probably begin with the Ribbentrop and Hitler meet with Molotov. Molotov comes to Berlin in November of 1940, and this begins to change very outwardly the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union. So maybe you want to comment on that and about this relationship.
Well, I mean, it's easier now to try to reconstruct the Russian game plan. We talked about in the last episode about the orders from Moscow. For the communists in Germany, they were not allowed to form an alliance with the Social Democrats to slow down the Nazi road to power. And these communists in Germany, they were told in no uncertain terms that the expectation was the Nazi regime would only last 2 years, maybe up to 5 years. The Nazis would fail, and then a revolution could take place. But we can probably tell that this was a lie. That the game plan was indeed different. The expectation was that Germany exhausts itself, and at the right moment, the Russians would take the initiative. Now, these revisionists afterwards, they made a big point of the Russian preparations for war. And so they make this argument that Hitler had no other choice and this and that. But when we talk about a war of that size, there's always many different options and sub-options. So a full-blown assault, a full-blown invasion is not the only choice that you have, especially when you can make a deal in the middle of it. You know, it's not just total defeat or total victory. There's all kinds of ways a war like this could end. So apparently the Russians were lying to anybody, even to their own people. Judging from the level of intelligence infiltration of Germany, there was I think an element of confidence on the side of the Russians, where they would offer the exact thing that Hitler wanted, that deal. And this is sort of the baseline logic of any intelligence service. They want to figure out what the other group or person, what it needs, the one thing that they absolutely want and need, and then you pretend to give it to them. But at the same time, the Russians were clearly aware of the strength of the British, because as well the British were infiltrated by Soviet intelligence. So there was a clear view on Europe. The Russians had a clear view, and the British had a pretty clear view on things, but the Germans did not have that full of a picture. So the Germans, they pretty much went in blind into the Soviet Union in certain areas. And so I mean, to me, the Russians were lying to everybody, even to their own people. They had reserve troops that the Nazis were not aware of, and the British were still a strong force. Now, they barely got away with Dunkirk. The expeditionary force could have been, grabbed and held hostage. But we're still talking about the British Empire with all its colonies and the bond system. They could finance a war. They could just produce, and of course the Americans could supply Britain. So I think it's a difference of how much you could see the situation, how much you know about yourself and the other players, and the Germans did not see enough. And I also think that these Soviet agents in Germany at the time, they were feeding a lot of false information and a false picture to the Nazi leadership. So for the Nazis, it seemed like a clever deal. I mean, we know from many sources, even Hitler himself, that ultimately he did want to attack the Soviet Union at some point. But Hitler was he had options when it came to that. So of course the Russians had an attack plan. The Russians always have some sort of attack plans to take over Europe. But it was the Russians probably had the best picture, because the British, they knew pretty much all about Germany, but the British didn't know that much about the Russians. I mean, that's the way I see that.
There's this fascinating book which really kind of started. This is Stalin's War by Ernst Topisch, and this book came out in the 1980s. This is the English language edition. The translation's a little bit awkward from what I can tell, but it has it. He really starts out similarly. Viktor Suvorov, who a few years later wrote his Icebreaker, which is, I mean, you want to get a copy of this book, it's probably $300 on Amazon to find one, maybe more now. Who started the Second World War, and it is, along with The Chief Culprit, which is Suvorov's follow-up book to Icebreaker, which came out, I don't know, was this 2012 or 11? This is The Chief Culprit, Stalin's grand design for the Second World War. And it really is, Suvorov has gone into greater detail, and having access to Soviet sources, he shows what Topisch, he verifies a lot of the thinking of Topisch. Now, Topisch was a German soldier in World War II. He fought in 6th Army. He did not get captured at Stalingrad. He was wounded and evacuated before the army was trapped. But he'd always thought about his comrades. He'd thought about the defeat of the Germans, and he loathed Hitler. Topisch did, and he thought there's something wrong with Hitler's strategic thinking, that Hitler got outwitted, and who outwitted him? Stalin did. And this is why Topisch calls it Stalin's War, that Stalin basically could have stopped the war by aligning with the Western Allies
Early
in 1939, and he did not. He kicked out the French and British delegations out of Moscow, invited Ribbentrop to Moscow, made the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, made Hitler his pal, agreed to divide the East between themselves, divide Poland, and with Russia getting the Baltic states and having access to Finland, while Germany would have then a free hand. And Hitler thought that this would make him safe from the British, because if he's invading Poland with the Soviet Union, surely the British and the French, who had made this agreement to protect Poland, wouldn't declare war on Hitler and Stalin. But Stalin was clever, as Suvorov points out in The Chief Culprit. It is, Hitler invades Poland on September 1st. The Allies then declare war on what the 3rd is their ultimatum, and the 4th they're at war with Germany of September. And then, so there's no declaration of war. And then Hitler's going, but the Soviet Union was supposed to invade with me.
Yeah.
And saying, where are the Soviet armies? And the reply comes from Moscow, well, we're having some problems organizing the invasion. We need a few more days. And of course, the Soviet Union does invade Poland on September the 17th, right? So when it's safe to say that Britain and France are at war with Germany, and they don't want to declare war on another country. The Soviet Union has invaded Poland. They've promised to protect Poland, but the Soviet Union says, "Oh, we're basically just invading Poland to keep Hitler from getting those parts of it."
Something I wanted to mention at this point was when we talked about the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson, and we remembered that Putin was blaming Poland for World War II. I mean, people have to remember how the situation that Poland was in. They had no way of forcing a certain plan onto everybody else. If you're surrounded by these different empires, it's just a bizarre statement when this was supposed to be a split of Poland. So the Nazis would get a piece, the Russians would get a piece, and as you said, the Russians they could have the Russians could have made a clear statement, not align with the Nazis and scare off the Nazis, because all these officers and party people with the Nazis, they followed along Hitler's lead because they believed that the Soviet Union was going to act a certain way, and they believed the British were going to act a certain way. So if you fool Hitler and all of his people, then this deception can actually work.
Yeah, and I should mention, connected to this is a fascinating piece of confirmation of Suvorov and Topish from a British researcher, intelligence writer named William West, and maybe Alex, you know his work. He wrote an important book on the background of Sir Roger Hollis, because as you know, in the late 80s, there was the Spycatcher scandal where the former deputy head of MI5, the British equivalent of the FBI, it's a British counterintelligence domestic service, was accused his boss, the head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, of being a Soviet agent, and that this explained everything that went wrong during the Cold War for British, Canadian, even in American intelligence to some extent, because we worked with the British. And this, in fact, it was the Thatcher government, and this book came out in '87. The Margaret Thatcher government banned the book Spycatcher. They banned it so it couldn't be published there. Now I have a copy here. It could be published in the U.S. I don't know if you've got a copy, if they translated it into German, but the book was a sensation because of this claim. Well, William West decided he really had access to good background information, and Roger Hollis had gone to China, and he believed that Roger Hollis, who was not a Cambridge mole, he went to Oxford, so he wasn't a Cambridge guy. He went to the Far East, and he believes that Hollis got recruited when he was in China and in the Far East in the interwar period. But Hollis comes back. He ends up joining MI5.
Despite not being qualified at all. He was not qualified to be a regular agent.
No, not qualified at all. And so World War II begins. And of course, what we just said is Hitler's really aligned with Stalin, and the communists in Great Britain, the Communist Party, just like the communists in France. By the way, the communists in France were causing unrest in the army, in the French army. They were trying to demoralize. The communists had orders to demoralize the Western powers. And what West reveals in his book is that the British Communist Party said, we are planning a revolution. We're going to take over Great Britain in the middle of this war, which is fantastic. And Roger Hollis was tasked with watching the British communists.
Yeah.
And what West shows is that he actually had these people, a lot of these people were his friends that he was watching. But he didn't tell MI6.
Oh, he didn't.
MI5 that.
Yeah, when he joined, he was not. He didn't tell them about his communist friends that he had earlier.
No, and in fact, so he was not really. He was keeping tabs officially, but he always had an excuse for why he wasn't detecting this plot. And what's really fascinating, and it absolutely dovetails with Suvorov's military claims about Russian war preparations. There was the expectation by the British communists that the Soviet army was going to reach the English Channel and would be in a position to intervene in Britain so that the British communists could take over. Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating is that Suvorov has this bit in his writings that the Soviet Union had developed, this is before Barbarossa, tanks made to cross the English Channel underwater, right? Now the Germans had developed a similar kind of tank. You put a giant snorkel on it, like a tube that would run up to the surface that could gather air and pump it into the tank while the tank crawled along the bottom of the seafloor the seabed. And of course, the English Channel is not that deep, so you can just drive the tank, and of course, the oxygen feeds oxygen into the engine so that you could have the engine function, because that needs oxygen for the internal combustion of the diesel engine, but also the crew could breathe and the exhaust could be carried out, and so that they could have tank regiments that could go along. And so why would and this is Suvorov's question, why would the Soviet army be developing tanks to cross the English Channel if they were loyal allies of Germany?
Yeah.
And the other thing people never talk about was Stalin's massive naval construction program. And in fact, Russia was building two of the largest battleships. I think they would have dwarfed the Bismarck for sure.
Hmm.
These super battleships that the Soviet Union was building, and massive naval construction plans. Why would the Soviet Union be building this giant navy at the same time? Which, by the way, the German invasion in 1941 caused Stalin to abandon this naval construction because he needed the sailors and the workers immediately to defend Leningrad, because the Germans came up on it so quickly. So you have this William West showing this, and Suvorov makes an additional point about the BT-7 tank. The Russians were developing tanks that you could remove the tread from the tank and put inflatable tires on the wheels. That it was convertible so that it could go 60, 70 miles an hour on the Autobahn, right? So it's a tank. And in Russia, there's except for just around Moscow and in Donbass, there's not a lot of paved roads in the Soviet Union back then. You know, there weren't paved roads connecting any of the major cities except maybe Tula and Moscow, and some of the cities in the Donbass. You know, so why would you make a tank that had this capability of operating on a paved road unless you were planning to invade Germany? And the same thing, he goes through the design of the Soviet Air Force. The design was they made their aircraft for attack and their fighters for attacking German bases and German aircraft on the ground, not for defending their own planes on the ground, not for fighter air defense, but for offense. And the Soviet army, in fact, when it was positioned on the border with Nazi Germany in 1941, they were not digging trenches in defensive positions. They were assembled in offensive formations, largely, with some exceptions in the far north of the line. But this is the way they were deploying. And this evidence Suvorov uses in both of his books to make a very strong case that the Soviet Union was preparing to attack Nazi Germany. And this, of course, goes back to the November 1940 meeting where Molotov comes to Moscow. And it's at this meeting that Hitler wants this, Soviet Union to join the war in earnest and to attack India. And Molotov wouldn't hear of it and is saying, why don't you hand over Finland? Hitler needs the nickel, I think, in Finland, if I'm remembering correctly. And he wants Bulgaria, and he wants the Turkish Straits. So Hitler is taken aback. And at this meeting, and we have the testimony of the translator who was there, famously saying that Hitler was very friendly. Ribbentrop was very friendly. They were basically very nice to Molotov, but Molotov was kind of snotty and cold and demanding in return. Did you want to make any comments about this meeting?
I don't remember that meeting particularly, but this was sort of the dream that the Russians have had for a long time, to have that invasion of Europe. And we talked about this about World War I. When Russia failed, they had all this preparation. They had a deal with the British, had a deal with the French, and the idea was to push through Poland and grab as much of Germany as possible. And but ultimately, as we know, Russia failed in this, and they had to give away territories. They had to formally give away Ukraine. But this was the second large attempt that was that was prepared, just to finally set these things right for from Moscow's perspective. And when we look at the German plan of punching into Russia, it's sort of the only advantage really that the Germans had was the speed, and the Russians, of course, they could always do what they've always done, have a flexible retreat system, just like with Napoleon, just lure the enemy in and wait and see. But the speed of the Germans had surprised the French. The speed had surprised the British. Because everybody was on amphetamines, everybody was just working like crazy for sometimes for days without sleep. And so that was the only advantage really that the Germans had, because they were at a disadvantage in terms of production. They were at a disadvantage in terms of the intelligence sphere. So really the only solution for the Germans would have been to follow the initial plan of Heinz Guderian and his colleagues to just punch into Russia and go straight for Moscow and take out the centers of command and the war production, or take over the Russian war production, because that was sort of the only way of countering, or the only way of doing this, really. I mean, the Germans were not really aware of the Russian preparations in full, but the Russians were probably taken by surprise, when it comes to the German speed of advancing. And this is something we saw on various fronts in the war, with the Africa Corps and Rommel. They were crazy about speed, and Rommel had learned this even early in France when he was stationed in France. They were literally overrunning the French positions, and this sort of became almost a competitive thing with the German officers, who gets there first. And the French were taken by surprise so much that sometimes they thought these German troops were French troops, because nobody expected the Germans to be that fast. And also, at some point, somebody like Rommel was so fast in the north of France, he actually left behind his support troops, and he came under fire because he was just shooting forward that fast. And it was a smart move by the Russians to have that amount of preparation without the Germans knowing. But I think the Russians truly underestimated the German speed they could come up with.
Yeah, they definitely did. The German speed was huge. And of course, Hitler had this understanding that he knew he had a very capable military machine. More capable. Everyone underestimated. The Germans weren't as well prepared for World War II as they were for World War I. Their divisions didn't have adequate artillery. Von Manstein even admits this. He said the Western Allies, when they attacked, were equal or in some areas superior to the Germans, except in morale and except in the leadership of the units. And then, of course, the doctrine, the ideas that they were following, the German officers had superior ideas of how to fight. And, of course, this idea of getting behind the enemy, punching a hole in the line and getting behind and disrupting the communications and the command and control and causing the enemy total confusion with mobile units in the rear was absolutely devastating to the French and the British, and it was extremely successful, this blitzkrieg. And it was going to prove even more successful, more devastating against the Soviets. Only the Soviet Union had so much territory, it had so many armies and so much depth, it could lose army after army. In fact, the Germans took more prisoners in the first stages of the war than they had themselves soldiers, captured more tanks than they had tanks from the Russians, to show you the power of the blitzkrieg, but also the tremendous resources
by the way,
of the Soviet Union.
There was something super important you mentioned in the last episode, and that was the when Lenin pretty much was aware in his day and age, that there would be another great war, and that also explains why Stalin was so adamant with the collectivization and the industrialization, and he wouldn't care how many people were killed along the way or put in a gulag along the way. It was that kind of speed because they all were aware they were planning, or at the top they were aware they were planning another great war. And when around the year 1941, the Soviet Union was kind of mature as an empire, whereas the Nazis were not. They just barely had managed to come out of this economic recession. They had overcome some of these obstacles, but a lot of the administrative structures were not mature yet with the Nazis. And of course, the espionage was total garbage. They didn't have decades of cleaning their own ranks, training these people, and getting this expertise and making everything function. Because when Barbarossa was about a year old, when the attack was 1 year in or almost 2 years in, the German economy was not yet transferred to a true war economy. It sounds crazy, but that's what it was. And even the efficiency of the production was not there. Now, some people think that the German system, the war production was working like a Swiss clock, but it wasn't. And that was something I think that goes back to how mature is an empire. I mean, the British were very mature. America was well established because they had this. America has had this great industrial push in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, and the structures of America, the administration, that was working fairly well. And we saw this, of course, later in the Second World War when America was able to mobilize like 12 million soldiers and all this equipment, and they were outproducing everybody else. So I think the maturity of an empire speaks volumes about what it can do. And originally, I mean, before Barbarossa, Hitler assured his people and basically lied to his people that there was going to be a big pause after Poland and Sweden and the oil fields in the south. There would be a great pause where Germany could mature as an empire and solidify the gains that had been made. And Hitler was telling everybody, I'm not going to live that long. My successor will, or my successors, plural, will solidify what I have won, and then we'll see. And there were these plans that Hitler talked about in his second book. He was planning for these multiple stages, and I think by the 1980s, he was planning. The plan was to attack America finally. But you can see that the German system, the German Empire, wanted to mature in stages, but they didn't have the time to do so. And you can see that in many instances, even before Barbarossa, because it's almost like a bad comedy. When you look at Albert Speer's memories, who was just an architect, right? And then he became responsible for the war production. I mean, even these assignments were comedic almost. And then when you look at the descriptions by Albert Speer about how decisions were made, you had to be close to Hitler, he had to like you had to talk to him in a specific way, and you could only get things done by being in that circle. And then, of course, this later problem that I will talk about later, when the flow of information to Hitler and from Hitler was managed by Lammers, Keitel, and Bormann. So it's almost comedic and insane if you think about it. Whereas the Russian system was mature, it worked, and they could give orders, and these orders were followed. And the British, they've had hundreds of years of experience.
And one of the reasons that administratively the Third Reich was weak, and it's a reason why the Russian Federation is weak under Putin, because Putin actually follows Hitler's practice in this way, is that Hitler liked his subordinates to have overlapping areas of responsibility so that they would conflict with each other. And it was Hitler's insurance policy to make sure everyone would have to come to him. So that what Hitler did was he would make sure they would his subordinates would all be in conflict with each other. So rather than cooperating and being forced to follow a common blueprint, he wanted them at each other's throats so that they would need him to mediate between them. And this is very typical of many dysfunctional dictatorial regimes, where there's a kind of insecurity in the part of the leader who he doesn't quite trust everybody, so it's better for them to all distrust each other more.
Oh
And
yeah.
this, of course, created a lot of dysfunction in the Third Reich.
Oh,
Um,
especially the Gauleiters. That's what they call these regional administrators in Nazi Germany. Hitler always had an issue with the Gauleiters, and they were quite powerful. And even Speer, when he was running the war economy, the war production, he was constantly facing this backlash from these Gauleiters. And it's really hard to reconstruct how how limited these people, in what a limited way these people could even make decisions, because remember, the Nazis were so immature when this was path to power was happened. Everybody was collecting incriminating material on everybody, and there was this weird dynamic. So many people, they couldn't even make certain decisions or agree with certain decisions because somebody had leverage on them, and this guy liked that guy more, and this guy was totally out of tune with reality. And it's just like it's almost like a dark comedy when you look back at it.
yeah. And so Hitler did not rule in the same style that Stalin did. And Stalin, of course, had created, through his purges, he had created this fear amongst his subordinates that if they displeased him, so they knew they were serving him, obedience to him was absolute. Any attempt to deceive the leader or to even irritate him risked going to the gulag or being executed. So that this system, it functioned. Now, this system has dysfunction in it too, because if everybody below you is scared of you, and they're scared, that means they're scared to tell you the truth, because
And
maybe
they'd rather do nothing than do the wrong thing. It's what we see in China
right.
today, where they become passive and they just don't do anything.
Well, because if they do something and it turns out to be wrong, they could be executed. There's a famous story of Stalin. This is after the war. There was a movie producer. Stalin went on vacation, and this producer had this film. He had to make a decision. He had a deadline, how to make the ending of the film, how to make it. And he thought, oh no, I can't reach Stalin. I can't find out what he wants, right? So he just guessed. And he gets called on the carpet. The film comes out. Stalin comes back from vacation. And so he's sitting, this poor guy, this film producer, sitting in this room where there's some Soviet officials there, and Stalin's coming from behind a curtain. And Stalin peeks out from the curtain. Oh, you went and made the end of the film without consulting me. And the poor guy is just trembling.
You bastard.
And he's saying, you guessed the end of the film.
Oh no.
And then and then he comes in and he sits down and he goes, and you're very lucky you guessed right.
Oh no. What's behind door
Yes.
number 2? Oh, it's execution. Behind door number 2 is execution. You picked wrong. But here's something else. I mean, in 1939, the United States lowered their stance about neutrality because they were informed about what was going on fairly well. So, starting in 1939, the United States decided that it would give military surplus to Germany's enemies. Now, this is when the United States gets involved, right? And still, the war economy of Germany was still very dysfunctional because Hitler insisted prices cannot rise for the consumers. These consumer goods have to be produced. Everybody's supposed to be happy. Everybody's supposed to love me. And Speer was discovering all sorts of madness in the production. He looked at various factories and he noticed that they were not even producing around the clock. They could do more shifts, but they didn't do that. There was a serious lack of workers in the war production, and also sometimes these goods were not ordered in large enough quantities to justify a machine production, a larger scale machine production. Some of these goods, artillery shells, this was still made the old way. And so he was pulling all kinds of strings, Albert Speer, and he managed to improve the output by 60% in a very short amount of time. Now, this is even when America was starting to ship military surplus to Germany's enemies.
Yeah, it's so anyway. So I should talk about the Ribbentrop the result of this Ribbentrop Hitler meeting with Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister. But I should first document in Topish's book, he has some cables showing the attitude of the Soviet government, and these attitudes are quite amazing. Molotov in 1940 at a meeting with the foreign minister of Lithuania um, made a remarkable statement, and I think somehow my thing got in the wrong. Sorry about that. Um, Here it is. This is what he says to the Lithuanian foreign minister on June 30th, 1940. We are now more than ever convinced that our brilliant comrade Lenin made no mistake when he asserted that the Second World War would enable us to seize power in Europe,
Oops.
just as we did in Russia after the First World War. For this reason, you should be starting now to introduce your people into the Soviet system, which in future will rule all Europe. Okay, so this is the foreign minister of the then neutral Lithuania, which was around this time absorbed by the Soviet Union when it took the Baltic states, and so this is a whole about a year before Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. Molotov is basically telling this Lithuanian foreign minister, we're going to own Germany. We're going to not only rule your country, we're going to rule Germany and all of Europe, because Lenin had this brilliant idea. And of course, this is the proof that Stalin was going to stab Hitler in the back. And of course, the idea that Hitler didn't know this, Hitler figured it out when Hitler only needed that meeting with Molotov to catch on, because Hitler was very sensitive to power relationships. Some of his generals, I think it was Keitel who commented, Hitler had this amazing sixth sense when it came to power relationships, what they really were. And Hitler realized that making a deal with Stalin, he realized in November 1940 that Stalin didn't intend to keep it. Now, maybe Hitler down the road didn't intend to keep it with Stalin, but Stalin had the idea of betraying him much earlier on in the relationship.
Oh,
and
yeah,
Hitler
of course, because the Russian game plan was much older than the German game plan, and that makes
more
a huge
long
difference.
range. Yeah, it was conceived earlier, and Hitler was a bit of an opportunist, as Topish points out. Hitler was an amateur when it came to international diplomacy. He really didn't understand what he was doing when he made his alliance with Stalin. He didn't realize that he was putting himself in a position to be exploited by Stalin later on, because here Hitler was then in late 1940, he was at war with Great Britain. Spain would not help him. Because, he thought, well, he helped
couldn't count
Franco
on the
in the
Italians.
Spanish Civil War.
You couldn't count
and
on
the Italians were worthless. No, I'm talking about Spain would not help him take
and
Gibraltar.
Italy was useless, yeah.
And Italy was useless, because we should mention what happened in late 1940 is that Mussolini conceived of taking over Greece. And he invaded Greece through Albania, which he had taken over, I think, in 1939, if I'm remembering correctly. He invaded Greece through Albania, and the Greeks defeated the Italian army and chased it back into the Albanian mountains, where they spent the winter of 1940 freezing. The winter of 1941 freezing. And this created a crisis for Hitler, because now Greece, because it was attacked by his ally Mussolini, was an allied country. The British sent troops into Greece, and now he had this problem of an allied country with British troops on the continent threatening his flank if he was going to invade the Soviet Union. And this is what he had decided. After his meeting with Molotov in November 1940, in December, he met with his generals, and he said, I have to invade the Soviet Union, because Stalin is not somebody we can do business with anymore. Stalin is clearly going to act against us. He's already pushing on us, and we can't give him what he wants, what he's demanding. So Hitler gave the order then in December, and I think most historians agree that is when he he had contemplated, said, think
Yeah.
about invading the Soviet Union, but he'd never. This was the concrete. We're going to do it. We're going to attack
Oh,
them in
and
the
just to
spring.
just to add one more thing, through this Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the Nazis were scaring the crap out of the Japanese. Now we can't go into all the Asian theater because it's such a huge chapter, but this was also a weird strategic diplomatic move, which ultimately led the Japanese to adjust their own plans. This
Yes,
was
in
this was
fact,
so
this is
dumb.
where Hitler outmaneuvered himself with the Japanese, because what he did was, by making see, remember, Japan and Germany were in the anti-Comintern Pact,
They
which is an
loved each other.
anti-communist pact,
They
right?
loved each other.
Right. So you had Germany, Italy, and Japan ostensibly agreed. And so this, at the same time, they're surrounding the Soviet Union. You got Japan is not only an island then, they controlled
Manchuria.
Manchuria. And of course, the Soviets controlled Mongolia. And of course, there's the German, the Japanese Kwangtung Army in Manchuria, which is one of the more powerful Japanese armies watching the Soviets. And of course, this is a threat. And in fact, there was a battle fought in 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, where the Japanese actually invaded Mongolia, Soviet Mongolia. They crossed into the Soviet Union, and there was this prolonged battle. I believe it was August of 1939, and they were actually defeated by Georgy Zhukov, who used tanks and airplanes. And of course, the Japanese did not try this again on the Soviets. So, the problem was is that, and of course, when this battle happened in August, there's when Hitler goes and makes this deal with the Soviet
Yeah.
Union, which of course the Japanese are going, hey, wait a minute, you were going to go east and we were going to go west and we were going to meet. Their idea was, we're going to squeeze, because the Japanese army was kind of in favor of war with the Soviet Union at the time. There were Japanese people that wanted to do this, Japanese military
Yeah.
leaders.
And it's
And of course,
interesting.
so
Yeah.
Stalin was in trouble, but what the consequence was, monkey see, monkey do. When Hitler had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Japanese went and got a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union too.
Yeah. That was the situation. And also, the Americans and the British, they were able to analyze the situation fairly well. So the Anglos, they knew fairly well what the German generals were thinking and planning, but ultimately Hitler made the decisions. So there's an example here. Oberbefehlshaber Erich Raeder was suggesting to hit Suez, to be active in Suez, to secure the oil and cut off the Brits and to calm down the Turks. And the American general staff member Marshall, he was expecting exactly that because it was military logic. But of course, the Germans made some weird decisions that was kind of catching many people by surprise. So these experts were seeing one thing, but Hitler was seeing something. Else. And Heinz Guderian and his colleagues, they were coming up with this elaborate plan to punch into the Soviet Union, take Moscow, take St. Petersburg, and have the centers of power and the centers of the Russian war production. But then Hitler came up with his own plan, which was very, very different. He was targeting the periphery. He was going north and going south, and then at some later point, they were going to go against Moscow. But the initial plan was about hitting Moscow when it was warm, which, of course, would have been the logical choice.
Yeah, the thing is, a country with what at that time 11 time zones, 12 time zones, because they had Ukraine and Belarus then, 12 time zones. So this is a country that's covering half the time zones, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is an incredible thing. You're going to conquer it. Of course, most of the Soviet Union, its industry and its population was in European Russia and Ukraine. and Belarusia. That's where most of it was. So if you did conquer that part, Siberia and the Caucasus in the south didn't amount to enough to really probably resist. So that is a fair point. But we should then mention that in this period, two intervening events then happened. One was Hess's trip to the UK, which you should talk about. His flight to Scotland to try to make a separate peace with the UK. And here Hess, the number 3 guy in the Third Reich, gets in a plane and flies, a specially modified plane, flies to Scotland, parachutes, crashes the plane, parachutes out so he can meet the Duke of Hamilton. And you have, as well at the same time, Yugoslavia under its monarchy was going to join the Axis, was going to be part of the Axis. And of course, Hitler needed to get troops down to Greece to help Mussolini. But then there's a political change of power. There's like a coup in Belgrade where a pro-Allied faction takes over, and Topish has evidence that Stalin is meeting with representatives of this new Yugoslavian government, encouraging them to resist the Nazis, although he's doing nothing to help Yugoslavia in practical terms. He wants them to tie Hitler up. So maybe you could talk about these two events, especially the Hess trip to Scotland.
Hess was super close to Hitler, and his public role eventually became reduced, but he was working behind the scenes, and his value was not just of personal value to Hitler, but also this network with the Anglos. I think there needs to be more work done on this because not everything has been discovered to this point.
Hess was born in Egypt, by the way.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to note. And he was an Anglophile. He was going to go to, was it Oxford or Cambridge? He was going to attend, but World War I got in the way of that. Am I remembering that correct?
Yeah, something along those lines. And I remember something along those lines. And Hess, he was and initially he had a bigger public role, but that role was reduced. He was not supposed to be in public that much. And he was having this connection with the Haushofer clan, the elder Haushofer who was developing his geopolitics concept, and the younger Haushofer, who also had very intricate ties to Britain. Now, the younger Haushofer's contacts in Britain possibly reached into the personal realm because Hess was most likely very gay, and the young Haushofer was possibly very gay, and they had these British contacts they wanted to meet, and there was probably some sort of a romantic relationship mixed in between. And we all know, in later decades, how much espionage was tied into these personal affairs, and especially homosexuals, because they had their own realm, and this all melted together. The espionage and the personal. And so the expectation of the Nazis was that they could achieve not just a change in with the throne of Britain, put their favorite candidate on the throne or back on the throne, but there was also going to be a political change. And this is what Hitler told his people for a long time, even before Barbarossa. And this was probably an argument of why they could do it or should do it, because they expected a massive change in Britain, a new king who was pro-Nazi and a new government that was pro-Nazi. And there were many more people involved. This is the story is told, for example, by Luke Hilzer in his book Churchill's Deception. There were many aristocratic British who served in the Air Force, a very high position in the Air Force, for example. And there were these constant visits. So they would always fly over. These Brits were flying to Germany, Germans would fly to Britain. So this was a common thing to have that direct line of communication and travel. And the Nazis always wanted to develop that relationship. They were inviting these British over, from the Air Force, for example. They didn't know that this Air Force guy was also a spy, for MI6 or SIS, what it was called back then. And so this British man would come to Germany. He was treated very well. And the Germans would show all these secret plans to him to create that bond of trust. And Hitler was happily using his aristocrats to work in secret diplomacy, because Hitler had no experience in diplomacy, and the regular diplomatic corps was already riddled with these aristocrats. But he also had a separate batch of aristocrats who were, had family ties to Britain, and he would constantly use them and trust them. So just traveling like this Hess flight to Britain was nothing unusual for the most part, but it was not so usual at that stage of the war.
Well, it's unusual in that the third highest ranking Nazi flies during time of
all
war
these secrets
in a fighter plane. Of course, Hess was a flyer in World War One. Flies to the enemy country and parachutes there to make a secret, to try to, what he was trying to do is make peace between Britain and Germany because this was May 1941. This was a month before Barbarossa. This is early May 1941. Barbarossa, Hitler goes to war with the Soviet Union in June, and Hess must have known this. And going there to urgently try to make a peace agreement, because then Germany wouldn't be in a two-front war if that agreement's made. And I should, as far as the King Edward VIII, we should clarify this for the people. King George V died in January 1936, and Edward VIII, Edward becomes the king, and Edward had it's believed to have Nazi, favorable view of Hitler, right? And I don't know, do you take that to be true, or was he just pretending? I mean, how do you take that?
Some of these parts of this grand deception maneuver, I think, worked best if even some aristocrats that were involved were not fully in the loop. So if you have like this cadre of people, because the previous king, from the House of Hanover, they had German roots, of course, but these it's the person on the throne is not necessarily the most powerful of these aristocrats, because if you're on the throne, you have all these tasks you have to do, visit all these places, so it's difficult to see who was more powerful with these aristocrats than somebody else. And some of these aristocrats, they played theater very well. They knew full well what they were doing, but I don't think all of these aristocrats knew what they were doing, because that deception would work better if some people are actually out of the loop. And this whole conspiracy narrative that's been around for 50 years, no, it was more like 70, 80 years at this point. The conspiracy ideology played a part, and also this the new trendy eugenics, racial purity, and have like a world of just Aryans running around, Nordic people running around. That made a great impression. So if you cultivate these narratives for 80 years, because the right wing picked up the conspiracy narrative roughly in the 1850s, if you cultivate that long enough, it's starting to stick really well. And if you look at the pre-Nazi right-wing extremist groups in Germany, a lot of them got money from aristocrats, and some of these aristocrats, they became sort of suspicious around World War I, because their family ties to Britain were so strong. But even before World War I, these aristocrats would often even change their names. They would abandon the British name, and they would have a German name, and they would start to get involved in these right-wing extremist groups, hating the Jews and the purity of the race and all that. So part of it was just theater and strategic posturing, but some of it actually stuck, because these aristocrats had a high degree of racial ideas, because the Hanover guys, King George V and his predecessors, this is the Welfen cluster that goes back to the year 800, and they became more powerful starting from the year 800 roughly. So they were very, very in tune with a racial ideology. They would marry their cousins, and then they would grow and grow to this ridiculous degree. So to many, it seemed kind of natural. And with Edward VIII, he may have believed he was just following, this racial idea and having this triple alliance. This is what Hitler also talked about in his first book, Mein Kampf. he wanted for a specific time wanted to have like three empires left in the world: the Americans, the British, and the Germans, and really nobody else of any significance.
Yeah,
So
I should
it
mention.
works
Yeah,
it works if everybody, if you know, it works if everybody in this group plays this theater very well, but it works even better if a portion of them, these aristocrats, actually believed it themselves.
yeah, I should mention that Edward VIII, of course, fell in love with an American. I think her
Wallace
name was
Simpson.
Simpson. Yeah, and it was kept secret, although American gossip papers knew about it. She was getting a divorce, and it was kind of kept out of the British press. But the Church of England was dead set against him having a friendship with a divorcee, let alone marrying one, which it seemed that was his intention. So he abdicated. He abdicated the throne because he basically for love. Um, and of course, this was for those who really were afraid of Nazi Germany. I think this was a relief to some of them. And of course, he went to Austria immediately after turning down the throne, and then he waited a decent interval till Simpson got the divorce. He married her, and he visited Adolf Hitler in October 1937. Met with Adolf Hitler, and and of course was celebrated by Nazi officials and so
Yeah.
on. And we should mention that when the war broke out after the fall of France, Edward went to Madrid, Spain. And this is where the crazy Ribbentrop thought up this harebrained plan, which I think it was thought to be a harebrained plan by Heydrich, the head of the SD of German security and intelligence services, the SS intelligence services, and they tasked Walter Schellenberg, who was not yet the head of foreign intelligence, SS foreign intelligence, to go to Madrid and kidnap a friendly kidnapping of Edward to bring him to Germany because they had the idea in 1940 that if they did defeat England, one of the conditions would be that Edward would return to the throne.
Yeah.
This was the
Yeah.
concept they had, which was Ribbentrop's scheme. You were talking about Hess going to Scotland and trying to negotiate a peace.
Oh, by the way,
Here you had this
before I
scheme
forget,
to kidnap
yeah.
Edward, the former King of England. Yeah.
Before I forget this point, because I think it's important for people to know, Ribbentrop himself, I don't think he was. I wrote about it in one of my books. He was not a genuine aristocrat himself, but he loved aristocracy, and he surrounded himself with aristocrats, and he tried to live like them. So he was surrounded by people that possibly likely spied for Britain, and the British.
He was a champagne salesman, wasn't he? Famously.
Something like, yeah, and the British for centuries, they had this massive problem with the British Islands, because once the British Islands get overrun, where do you escape? America and play the second fiddle, or the colonies and try again? You could never get back into Europe again, and so this problem had been around. When Napoleon did his invasions, and Napoleon at some point even considered invading the British islands, and so in World War II, or even before World War II, and even before World War One, this theater of the British to plan, to do this propaganda game with the Germans and with the conspiracy ideology, that theater was baseline survival. And some people wrote about it in a more detailed fashion. For example, Professor Carroll Quigley wrote about this in one of his books, the shorter one, not the massive one. And Quigley, he always maintained that he loved the Anglo way of life, the Anglo culture, but Quigley said there were these secret levels within Britain, and they make these decisions that can prove to be disastrous. So, for example, he always complained that the British should have taken a stand early on when Nazi Germany was still forming and when it was still weak. If the British had not done the appeasement, and if the British had coordinated with the French and all of that, maybe the situation would have gone
Hitler
a lot
would
better.
have. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this biography of William Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German military intelligence. Oops, got it upside down. It's a very good one. It's one of the earlier ones. There's a later one that goes over a lot of the same material with more recent things. But Canaris literally, as I mentioned last week, he was going to overthrow Hitler during the Czech crisis in 1938, and it was all the ducks were lined up. It was going to happen. But when Chamberlain announced he was going to
Yeah.
Germany to meet with Herr Hitler, it all came undone.
Oh yeah,
And
and also of
when
course,
Hitler got what he
yeah,
wanted, the conspiracies of the generals to overthrow him didn't then regenerate
yeah,
until you have the July plot in July 1944,
and
which is late in the war when they're losing. So
yeah, and of course
they
the
did,
generals,
yeah.
the generals. I mean, most of the generals, I think even 2/3 or 3/4 of the generals in Germany, they were all aristocratic from these old families. And so they had these back channels. There were always aristocratic back channels
Yeah.
to Britain, and they were desperately trying. They were desperately trying to get some sort of a public statement of Britain. You know that they would. Mostly it was Britain was supposed to say in public they would not attack Germany if there was a change in the German power structure, because the generals, they wanted to get rid of Hitler, either kill him or ban him to his favorite mountain and come up with some story, and there may have been there may have resulted a German civil war, and they always wanted to get a public confirmation of Britain that they would not intervene, they would not seize the opportunity and attack Germany, but none of these statements ever came. Nothing ever happened.
Yeah, in fact, appeasement strengthened Hitler's hand and gave Hitler prestige that he wouldn't have otherwise had, because then suddenly he was the statesman that had won this territory without a war for Germany. And this was extremely popular to have leveraged this. And this meant the German generals could not go against him because he had been right.
Yeah.
And he had done something right, right? Thanks to Chamberlain helping him out. And Mussolini played a role in that, by the way. Mussolini actually suggested, when it was falling apart, when the whole Munich process was falling apart, let's do it again. Let's recommit to this. So this is the problem when you negotiate with a crazy dictator, and people should think of this in terms of a lesson, which I think the Ukrainians and some Europeans
Oh
understand
yeah.
regarding Putin today,
Oh yeah.
is that you don't want to sit down with this guy because you are going to strengthen him tremendously within his own
Oh yeah.
country
I
if you
just
give him what he wants.
that's exactly the point, because yesterday I was doing an interview with somebody from France, and he was asking me about the French position, and may France in the near future leave NATO? Could Germany leave NATO, or could they suspend membership or some deal like that? And I said, well, the French, they were hedging their bets multiple times in history, but now today, if you make the wrong decision, you will never be able to correct that mistake. And we saw this before the Ukraine invasion. So many countries, they were giving these weird signals. We're not going to intervene. We're going to forgive Russia. We're just going to punish them by giving them a slap on the wrist, and we're just going to trust in their willingness to cooperate. And it was giving all the wrong signals, even though it should have been made clear from the very beginning that these borders cannot be touched. We're not living in that age anymore. That was supposed to be the message. But with Carroll Quigley, I mean, Professor Quigley was able to look at these papers from the roundtable groups, the Cecil Rhodes group and all that, and so he was trying to make the point that he loved the Anglo realm, but he didn't trust their ability anymore to make these secret decisions in these circles that were so secret nobody was even supposed to know that they existed, because there's always even something more deep and more deep and more deep. It was hard to get into MI5 and MI6 like Roger Hollis, because officially it didn't even exist. The existence was supposed to be kept secret, so you had to know people, you had to get into MI5, but there were levels above MI5 and there were levels above Cecil Rhodes's group and all that. So that was the point that Carroll Quigley made. And of course, this point got twisted by conspiracy literature, especially the John Birch Society. They try to make it appear as if Quigley was some sort of a conscious member of the conspiracy, and he was bragging about the conspiracy, and he was talking about this should be more open. But this was a complete distortion of what Quigley actually said. He was warning people about the appeasement, about the circles that were responsible for the appeasement. And so people should be more transparent in the British system, because if there's no transparency, more bad decisions of that nature could result. And we see this with Russia in the 1990s, and the way Britain handled Russia in the 1990s and the 2000s. You saw the British monarchs in the 90s, I think it was even in 91 or something, these British monarchs, they were visiting St. Petersburg, and everything was so nice, and all this Russian money was allowed to flow into the city of London. It was a disaster. It was exactly what Quigley had warned about.
Yeah, it's you have a problem when you have a free system and you're dealing with a dictatorship. You have a problem that if you do the wrong thing, you strengthen. Dictatorships are by nature weak because there's no outlet for popular discontent. If you increase the prestige of a dictator like Hitler or like Putin or like Xi, you strengthen their ability to oppress their own people and commit crimes domestically, but also to commit aggression abroad. And this is what they did. They basically enabled Hitler without really realizing the damage they were doing, and they realized too late. And so anyway, getting back to Hess's trip to England, the big question has always been whether Hitler authorized this trip of Hess to England. And it is, to me, inconceivable that Hess would have gone off half-cocked on his own. And I cite two authorities on this. Christa Schroeder, Hitler's senior secretary, and his valet, Heinz Linge. If you read their memoirs, and these people, day to day, Heinz Linge was with Hitler every day of the war, of this whole thing. And Christa Schroeder, the same thing. They had their days off, of course, but these people worked very long hours right next to Hitler. They knew him, and both of them say in their memoirs that they simply didn't believe. Hitler put on this big act when it became public. See, because Hess's arrival in England was supposed to be a secret. He was going to do these secret negotiations, and if he succeeded, it would just be announced.
That would have been the biggest sensation in modern history. I mean, just by doing that mental experiment, if Hess had succeeded, if the British had aligned with the Germans, this could have changed everything, because the Nazis could have been focused on the East. It would have scared off the Americans. No more supplies from America. The Japanese would have changed their strategic outlook.
If it worked, it would have destroyed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, if Hess's mission had been possible, it would have destroyed the USSR.
Oh, and of course, Hitler loved these gambles. He loved these bold moves, and it was just Hitler's style. This was actually Hitler's style.
That was Hitler's style. And what's interesting is that when the news came that Hess had flown to the UK, Hitler went into a rage, right? And as we study Hitler, most of his rages were play acting. And we know this from various sources, even from Sir Neville Henderson's confrontations with Hitler when the war was about to begin. He realized that Hitler's rages were fake, and he put on a rage of his own.
He even rehearsed this stuff in front of a mirror.
Right. He would rehearse his rages, and of course Neville Henderson rehearsed his own rage on the eve of World War II. And Hitler was sort of sitting there with his arms folded, sort of sitting with his butt on a table, and he just calmly. Hitler didn't get upset at being raged at being accused by Henderson. He just sat there quietly, just calmly, which meant that Hitler was perfectly in control of himself. These were he could control it when somebody when Hitler was really angry, that happened when he lost his temper with Guderian at the end of the war.
Yeah, and also Hitler thought the the politicians in Britain were super weak and the aristocrats were
Yes.
super strong. And of course, if somebody like Hess gets arrested and interrogated and whatnot, Hitler probably expected this thing to go smoothly. He probably didn't understand. He probably thought the politicians would not actually get a hold of Hess that much. It
That
would
they
be
would
kept.
respect him as an
Yeah,
emissary, right?
yeah, and he
That he
would
was
be
an
in.
emissary of peace.
Hess would be in safe hands, with these officers and these aristocrats, and it would all work out fine in the end. But
Yeah.
this was because when I read Kilser's book, Churchill's Deception, for the first time, I immediately thought there should be like multiple sequels to this because there's so many areas that haven't even been reconstructed yet. Because Kilser apparently he doesn't know that much about the older history of the aristocrats and their ties into Germany, especially in the 1800s. So there were so many families in Nazi Germany that were so old and so trusted, and if you look at these family lines, you could see general, you could see administrator, you could see chancellor, you could see this and this and that. So there was a network, possibly a spy network that was just an insane size, and they probably had people everywhere at this point.
And the thing is, this overestimation of the political power of aristocrats by World War II, you had the coalition government under Churchill in the UK had socialists in it. It was
Oh yeah,
dominated by the bourgeoisie and the working class. The aristocrats were were dominant when Chamberlain was in power and when Baldwin was in power, but the aristocracy had lost its political grip by the time Churchill becomes prime minister. And the Third Reich is by no means an aristocratic formation. The Nazi Party is too plebeian, it's too lower middle
yeah,
class to actually have any true aristocratic leanings. So it was a kind of a vein from the point of view of analyzing the aristocracy as a social force that could suddenly change the relationship between Germany and Britain. It was just a fantasy. And of course, in order to cover his tracks, Hitler declared that Hess was insane, that Hess had been psychologically unbalanced for some time. Now, this was damaging because why would the number three guy, if Hermann Goering dropped dead of a heart attack and Hitler was assassinated or something, Hess would be the Führer, right?
yeah.
So this is the
I
third
mean,
guy.
this was not even a meeting on neutral territory. When you had, then there were meetings like this during the war where you could just pinpoint a spot, in Spain or whatever, or some island.
They had meetings in Sweden and Switzerland during the war.
You could designate
yeah.
a point in Switzerland to meet, and every side could bring some security forces, and everybody would come disguised, with a fake passport or whatever, and then you could have a talk. But this guy, Hess, he was such a hardcore believer in his plan. He had a small plane modified with additional fuel tanks, so he could actually go that distance. And if I remember correctly, because there was no landing procedure planned per se, so he would just turn his plane upside down, fall out of his plane, and then deploy his parachute. So there wasn't even any sort of traditional planning involved in terms of having a safe way out, like you would see in other meetings of that.
In fact, he did the flight at night, which was it was actually an amazing feat that a madman couldn't have performed it because
Yeah.
you had to navigate when it was pitch dark. He had to fly at night because he would be shot down in broad daylight. People would see him. And then he had to find get close to the place he wanted to land. And of course it ended up he was arrested, of course. So Hitler had the insanity defense. Hess was insane, and of course the fear was, what would the Japanese ambassador say, what would his allies say, and so on. And so Hitler and of course Hitler had to cover up the fact that he had sent Hess, because anything Hess might, under interrogation, tell the Allies might be important intelligence. And if Hess was insane and had done this on his own, then the whatever Hess told the Allies wouldn't necessarily be believed,
Yeah,
right?
and also the British never wanted to let go of Hess. I mean, he was imprisoned for a
No,
long time, and then they presented
he was in
somebody.
prison until he
Yeah,
died in like 87, was it?
yeah, and at some point, somebody was presented as Hess, but his X-rays didn't match the actual person of Hess because Hess had a wound from World War One, and that wound was not
Yes.
visible. And so the British probably got so much out of him that you could never let him out in public. You could never let him tell the story or even part of the story. And so
Do you
yeah, so
think? What do you think of the claim that the Hess that appeared at Nuremberg was the real Hess or an imposter? Have you heard this story?
yeah, I've heard that, but I would have to reread some of the literature on that
Yeah,
to give an informed opinion about that because it wasn't it was at the time you didn't have biometrics safe for
right.
X-rays and medical files, dental
It
records.
was 1970 or 69 that the British doctor discovered that the Hess that was in the prison there, what's the name of the prison near in Berlin there?
I don't remember that name.
That they kept Hess at after the war.
Landsberg,
And they
Landsberg.
would Landsberg, yeah. So they had like the Russians would guard him for so many months, and the British or Americans would guard him for so many months, and they would rotate. Remember, they had that
Yeah.
system for guarding him. So there's a mystery. There's some kind of secret. There's something going on there that has been kept secret by the British, by the Allies, and
Yeah, I mean
not
the
sure what it
Germans
is. Would be interesting to know.
the Germans were already failing at that point on the diplomatic front, the intelligence front, the war production, and also, the British, of course, had their Bletchley Park Ultra unit, where they were able to break the German encryption that was used. It took a while until the story was told in public, and they told a limited version of the actual story because. As we all know, the Germans were using the Enigma machine. This looked like an overblown typewriter. You could type in the message, it would scramble the message, and then you could send the message in its scrambled form, and then the other side would unscramble the message to make it readable. And so this was a nifty little machine that had all these moving bits and pieces, so you could scramble the signal in a very, very complex way. And so the British were able to not just gain access to some code books and some of these newer Enigma machines that the Germans were using, but the British, the British were also recruiting some experts from Poland that had started this kind of work earlier. And they could, I think at that point, the Polish could actually break the encryption of the two-ring version or the three-ring version or something like that, or they were very close to it. And so they had these experts, and at some point the British were making this big machine that could actually make these encoded messages readable. But I discovered something else. When I was reading into the Enigma, many experts on cryptography have commented on this machine, and they were very curious about some of these weaknesses in the machine, because if some little bits and pieces about the Enigma had been a little bit different, the encryption would have been strong enough for decades to come. It would have required much more computing power to brute force break this encryption. So why were these mistakes made? And that's when I found some interesting links of the people who designed the Enigma and who built the Enigma. And I strongly suspect a British spy ring, or maybe even a Russian spy ring, because with the British you could never really tell. And the spy ring probably implemented these weaknesses into the Enigma, making it easier
So in other words, the
to
code
break it.
machine was built by people some of who were
Yeah,
spies and made sure that
exactly.
weaknesses were built into it.
Because some of these people they trace back to Sweden. Some of these people had connections to
Mm.
Russia, because the scientific community was still fairly small at that point. People knew each other, and some people were working on the same systems. Now, the Enigma was not an original Nazi design. It was presented, I think, in the 1920s. In an earlier version, it was presented in public at an expo. So here is this company presents this machine and says, this is more advanced encryption that's ever been done, because most countries, even the Americans, they were still using this cylinder encryption machine with these rotating dials, so you could use that, and it was not an electronic device, but the Enigma was
They were using
electronic.
those in the American Civil War, weren't they?
Yeah, and
That was the
even
standard encryption machine.
even Thomas Jefferson, in Thomas Jefferson's belongings, there was a French language version of this cylinder design encryption device, and so this company presented this new machine and had all these electronics to scramble the text, and they were trying to sell it, but nobody wanted it. And then so the Nazis started to buy these machines, and they were demanding a stronger version with a fourth wheel and then a fifth wheel. But the British program, I mean, the Polish actually bought some of these early machines, and they started to work on them, trying to find its weaknesses. And so that Polish research ended up with the British. But apparently these weaknesses were built into the Enigma. Now the estimations are, had this thing been designed better, the encryption would have been good enough right into the 1960s and 1970s, because the Enigma was continued to be used after the war. I mean, even the communists in occupied Eastern Germany, they were still using the Enigma. They didn't know that it was broken, but it was probably aspiring. And when we're talking about a British / German spy ring, possibly messing up the Enigma, they could also be a Russian connection. So there's a possibility the Russians knew about these weaknesses, and maybe the Russians were able to decrypt this traffic.
Well,
too.
the Russians were the masters of human intelligence, and we can talk about the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, which was the GRU spy ring in the heart of Europe. And they called it that because it would get the information, and it had these different. I think they called them, some of them, pianists or players, who would then send the signals from the Low Countries to the Soviet embassy in London. So they would send the signals there, and of course from there it would go to Moscow. They would get all this vital information, which shows us that Stalin was perfectly aware of Hitler's plans to invade the Soviet Union. And so what more recent historians realize is that as soon as Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, Stalin knew that Hitler was going to try to invade. And so Stalin was then mobilizing his forces to strike first. And of course, who was going to be able to organize and mobilize to strike first in the spring of 1941 became the race of what happened. And of course, who won the race? The Germans are better organizers than the Soviets. They were able to get their act together because they were already at war. They were already mostly mobilized. They had already been fighting. They were fighting in the Balkans in 1941. They wiped out Yugoslavia very quickly. They closed on Greece. They attacked Greece through Bulgaria, flanked the Greek armies that were fighting the Italians, and rapidly took it, and then did an air assault on Crete, where the British forces had retreated to, and won the island of Crete in this incredible first air mobile battle, where there was just an invasion from troops coming from the skies and dropping paratroops and seizing airfields, and flying mountain troops in behind the paratroopers. Incredible victory there for Germany. But again, meanwhile, this massive preparation for attacking the Soviet Union was underway, and Hitler would do things like claim that he was faking, he was going to invade Britain, but he was faking a buildup against Stalin to fool the British when he was really going to attack Britain. And of course, I don't think, a lot of historians think that this is what fooled Stalin, but I don't think Stalin was fooled.
No.
I think that it was very important for Soviet historians to depict Stalin as the innocent victim of Hitler's aggression, the naive victim. Imagine Stalin, the paranoid Stalin, being naive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's inconceivable, but this is the mainstream history that we're told, that Stalin was tricked by Hitler and got stabbed in the back by Hitler. I mean, this is the guy that's never going to be stabbed in the back. And when Suvorov points out the massive Soviet deployments and preparations, the movement of the railroads, even General John Fuller wrote in his history of the Second World War, he said, we don't have all the documentation yet, but he says, I know this before Hitler attacked, the Soviets were railing troops from the Far East and were mobilizing. We knew this was happening. So it's impossible that the Soviets were surprised in the technical sense. What they were surprised about was they weren't able to mass and get ready in time.
Yeah.
And there was also this thing where they didn't know the exact date, because initially their spies were saying Hitler would attack in May. But there was too much rain in May. It was too muddy. Hitler couldn't advance. Hitler was also stuck in Greece and Yugoslavia. Remember, the Battle of Crete happened in May 1941. He didn't have all of his troops ready. He had to refit his panzers. There was a whole panzer corps involved in Greece.
And the production, the war production was nowhere near where it should have been in Germany.
Yeah, and so Hitler wasn't ready to go in May. The weather wasn't cooperating. He couldn't go in early June. They kept having dates where they would attack, and they kept putting it back. So he imagined Soviet intelligence. Well, you said they were going to attack, and I think the first date was maybe May 10th, then June something, and it was like, well, they're not doing it. So it is also possible that with these false, because you have perfect intelligence, and the intelligence is saying they're going to attack on that day. Well, the day comes and it goes, and it's like, they didn't attack. What happened with his intelligence? Well, the intelligence was right at the time, but conditions change. So there was uncertainty, and the Soviets were behind in getting ready. So I think that they were, in a way, they were fooling themselves, thinking they could still strike first. Because what Suvorov says is the evidence is that Stalin was going to attack Hitler in the first Saturday in July, because the Germans liked to attack on Sundays, and the Soviets preferred to attack surprise attacks on Saturdays. And the reason, it has to do with the alcohol cycle.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to attack on a Friday, you're really getting ready if you're going to attack on a Saturday, you're getting ready on Friday, which means you've stopped the weekend drinking bout. Mm-hmm. If you wait till Sunday, your army's drunk, right?
Yeah. No.
And you're not going to be ready to attack. It's going to not work. So,
yeah.
That is the alcohol cycle was, I think, a factor in why. I've heard this explanation. I don't know. Maybe somebody who knows more can correct me. But why, the Russians would attack like Finland on a Saturday or Japan on a Saturday. So Suvorov thought that it was the first Saturday in July. Well, the Germans attacked on a Sunday, July 22nd, 1942. And 1941, attacked June 22nd, 1941. And it was a disaster for the Soviets because the Germans caught their Air Force on the ground, caught their troops in attack formation, and they caught the Germans. And of course, according to Brian Fugit in his book Barbarossa, the Germans had sent their divisions forward first to send the heavy artillery later. So the artillery was still in the Stalin line, which is back towards the original border, the older border, before they annexed Poland, and they hadn't moved it forward. So here you had rifle divisions without howitzers, and you had the tank divisions without their howitzers. And so it was a catastrophe for the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, we know this especially from Rommel when he was experimenting with new tactics in terms of infantry, because he was an infantryman first. This is what people don't remember about him usually.
Yeah.
He was an infantryman just like Hitler, sort of was an infantryman. That's why they also had his connection. And even during his infantry days, even in World War One, Rommel was experimenting because they were trying to do things faster. They were fighting in different territories. So, for example, when you're in the mountains, and you fire machine guns, the bullets that don't hit the enemy, they cause all sorts of rock shrapnel that flies everywhere. And when you encounter a little patch of the woods, if you see a bunch of trees, normally the infantry manual and the training told you to set up defensive positions and then work your way forward step by step. But Rommel was just experimenting. He would fire certain ammunition into the woods and just see what would happen. And he was coming up with these new ways, and they were really increasing the speed. But the equipment was the problem. In June of 1941, the Germans had about 3,500 tanks to be deployed, and half of them were quite old. The Soviets had way more tanks, and the Soviets were making 5,000 more tanks every year. The German production was only 3,000 tanks per year, and those were not even heavy tanks. It was only in 1942 when the Panther tank, the Type 5 Panther tank, was made. And so this was a production problem. And even some of these generals were complaining a lot about this. And the decisions were made for certain operations based on the available equipment. So Halder and von Brauchitsch, they wanted to resign over all of this. And Hitler was the master of excuses. So when he would have these one-on-one meetings oftentimes with his generals, the general would come in and explain the situation, explain the problems. Hitler had already made up his mind, and he would tell a pre-prepared, rehearsed excuse. He was telling one general, well, I need those tanks to give them to Rommel. But then he would tell Rommel, no, I need these tanks somewhere else, and so you're not getting as much as you actually need. And so this was kind
they also reorganized the panzer divisions for Barbarossa. In the invasion of France, there were 2 panzer regiments in a panzer division and 1 motorized infantry regiment. In Barbarossa, they changed it so that a panzer division would only have 1 panzer regiment and 2 motorized or later mechanized, what they call panzer grenadier regiments. So that this is rather a curious, and of course this is curious. So it meant that the panzer divisions had fewer tanks, and of course there's I think 1 tank battalion assigned usually to one of the infantry formations in a panzer division, but it was fewer tanks. It meant that you only had, instead of 400 tanks per division, you only had 200 tanks per panzer division. Sorry, even less than that. But I think that's approximately right, because there wasn't actual uniformity in all the divisions, but so that they could make more panzer divisions, so that when they invaded the Soviet Union, they had 4, they called them panzer groups, 2 in Army Group Center and 1 on each of the flanks. And we should mention that when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Germany was going to have Finland, that had been bullied by the Soviet Union, join in the north, and Romania, that had been bullied in June of 1940 and had territory taken from it, Moldova, for example, taken from Romania, would join the Soviet Union to extend the front. And German 11th Army 11th Corps was deployed to Romania. So there was this. So this was part of the Barbarossa operation, but the main German armies were positioned in Army Group North in East Prussia, Army Group Center just east of Warsaw, and Army Group South down in what would before been southern Poland, so southeastern Poland, and they struck out in three different directions
Mm-hmm.
from this at beginning, and of course made incredible gains, except for Army Group South that got checked in the south. Army Groups North and Center made tremendous gains, and so tremendous that it looked like literally the German generals were ecstatic and thought we've literally won the war in the first 2-3 weeks of the
Yeah.
war.
And that was the reason why such strange decisions were made regarding the war production. So, for example, Albert Speer was talking about this aspect a lot. He said that before 1942, the ammunition production was fluctuating a lot because it was just increased before a blitzkrieg operation, and then the ammunition production was lowered again. And imagine this: the German army goes into the Soviet Union in 41, but it took until 1942 to have the ammunition production be continuous, right? To have multiple shifts, work around the clock, and just keep pumping out these artillery shells and other
We
types of ammo.
should mention Fritz Todt was a minister of armaments and munitions before Albert Speer, and I think didn't he die in a plane accident after visiting Hitler in 1942, right?
I think so, yeah.
And what's really peculiar, and I don't know what the speculation you've heard, but I've heard the speculation that Fritz Todt was assassinated. He was killed. His plane crash was arranged. Now that's a theory that people have. And Fritz Todt, I believe he built the West Wall, right? Just before the war started, he was the one responsible for that. He was like an engineer, but apparently he was not terribly effective in doing his job. And is it possible that Hitler couldn't fire him, or somebody got rid of him? What have you, from the German side, has anybody made these kind of suggestions?
Well, usually the speculation revolves around personal liking and who this person was connected to. So if there was a personal connection, that could have made the difference because Hitler made these choices all throughout this period. And also sometimes it's simply if you had powerful friends, if you had the right friends that were close to Hitler, that could also change a lot. Because remember when Albert Speer talks about the dynamic around Hitler, when you made mean jokes about someone and Hitler would laugh at these jokes, this would set a process in motion where Hitler would lose trust in that targeted person. So you couldn't have a discussion with Hitler. You couldn't say, well, let's have a chat. This guy, I don't like him. He's not competent, blah, blah, blah. Hitler wouldn't really bite on this. But if you started to make these subtle jokes and you just cleverly insert some things into the conversation, you would seed an idea. You would just seed an idea and watch it grow in Hitler's mind. You could actually torpedo somebody's career, and at the same time, with these techniques, you could also keep somebody's career going. So that's
Fritz Todt had, if I'm remembering right, had a big argument with Hitler just before he got on that plane at Rastenburg at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters on the Eastern Front in East Prussia. He had this argument with Hitler. And I'm not sure we know what the substance of the argument was, but it was described as rather heated at the time, and so and it's very funny. Albert Speer was personally at the Wolf's Lair when this air accident happened, where Todt died. So did somebody tamper with the plane? And I think if I remember right, the night before, Todt and Speer were going to fly in that plane together. But Speer decided to stay there overnight and because he was tired and he canceled joining him. So they both would have died on the plane,
Yeah.
which is, it's all very suggestive. And of course, I don't think we know, and I don't know I've never seen the report on the accident, what happened, but the suspicion of an assassination centered on Hitler as the person who was annoyed at him, didn't want the confrontation of firing him, and so just decided, well, we'll kill him.
It was
Right?
probably there was probably even an assassination attempt against Speer himself, because he tells a story of how he got sick very, very much so, very quickly, and then he was in, during his medical treatment at some other place. He was already losing access to Hitler, which was devastating. Like people like Martin Bormann, they always stayed close. They never took a day off. So Speer was outside of Hitler's circle, and then Speer was told that somebody was planning to mess up the medical treatment and get rid of Speer, because Speer had many enemies, even though Speer was just ambitious. Speer was just ambitious, but not overly ambitious. He always had the overall situation in mind, and because he was an architect by training, right? So, and for a long time he even didn't get a salary for a while as an architect, and so he wasn't as hyper ambitious as these other people that he had problems with, and so he was watching how 1 million soldiers were lost in Operation Barbarossa. This was in 42. So again, the war production was not good in 1941. It was not good enough in 42. 1 million soldiers were lost, and only then did Speer get the permission to change the ammo production, to have a continuous ammo production, and also using all the industrial techniques to make these things faster. He was able to increase the output by 60% without using more labor, without using more workers. He was demanding more workers, but he didn't get them most of the time. And he even got some weird feedback from within this crazy, incompetent Nazi circles. For example, when he was assigning engineers to have more decision power, right? He would just give these people more decision power because they were able to do their job properly. He got some negative feedback, and the feedback was, this is too American. This style that you're using, this is too modern. This is too American. We don't like it because we're being very traditional here. And by that time, of course, the American industry was hyper powerful, but they were still talking in these terms in Germany, saying that we don't want an American style here. If you don't have that background, if you don't have that party standing, you shouldn't be able to decide anything, even though the engineers were able to make better choices. And if you demanded more workers, these Gauleiters would protest, because these Gauleiters, they had all these ambitious projects, building new city blocks and making all this stuff and raking in all this money. So they didn't want to give up their workers to produce ammo for the war that was going on, and already 1 million soldiers were lost. So this is, again, this insane psychopathic comedy show that was Nazi Germany at the time. And
well, I should also, the elevation of psychopaths in the Third Reich, and it's a problem in the United States, in the Soviet Union. Modern states elevate psychopaths, and of course there's the theory that Speer himself arranged the assassination of Fritz Todt. That's one of the theories, that Hitler didn't do it. Therefore, that is Speer, and of course there is Yale University Press has came out. I read the book when it came out in 2017. I actually read it twice because I found it disturbing. It's Martin Kitchen's Speer, Hitler's Architect. It's a very long book, but it really depicts Speer as a pathological liar, as a malignant narcissist, or maybe even a psychopath. And it is like many of these Nazi biographies or biographies of Soviet or Chinese leaders and modern communist leaders. You become sick to your stomach as you read about this guy, how he behaved, how he depicted himself. Always he was the artist of putting himself in a good light and other people in a bad light. I mean, his image is always central. But the actual core of Albert Speer was very dark. He was efficient. There's no doubt he increased this efficiency, but part of it was smoke and mirrors, this biography argues, because he was a man of cultivating an image. And so made the switch, right? They didn't hang him at Nuremberg, but if they'd known what he had done as armaments minister, the way he treated the brutal treatment of the laborers, of the forced labor, they would have hung him, right? If they'd had an honest telling.
He was super detached. I mean, he made sure he was in front of a desk, sitting on a chair, and that's something that we also saw from Hitler. I mean, Hitler made these decisions, signing some document, just getting a lot of people killed, shipping people in the concentration camps. Hitler was making these decisions on his desk, but Hitler would always stay away from the carnage. He was terribly afraid of it, and he was reportedly having signs of PTSD from World War I. He didn't want to see the carnage, and many people in the Nazi leadership were like that. And there was this disconnect between the generals and the political leadership, because it's one thing to sign these orders, it's another thing to actually to do that. And of course, these generals were protesting, we should treat these people better in Poland, we should treat these people better in Ukraine because they could help us against the Soviets. But the decision was always made to go another way and massacre people and just antagonize them. There's an interesting new book.
That's important. Walter Schellenberg's memoir talks about how Schellenberg said, why don't we treat the Russians better? Why don't we treat the Poles better? And of course, he could get nowhere with Himmler or Hitler with this.
Yeah, there's a fairly recent book out in Germany. I'm not sure if there's an English translation there yet, but this is about Erich Koch. He was at first just
he was a monster. Well, Kilzer talks about Koch in his book Hitler's Traitor, that Koch was possibly a Soviet agent.
Yeah, exactly. And so Erich Koch initially was just responsible for a backwater, part of Germany. It was not prestigious, and it was a fairly small area. But as the Nazis
head of
advanced, Ukraine. He was running Poland at some point. He was running Ukraine, large parts of Ukraine. So he became the territorial master. He was administrating the largest piece of Germany that there was, and so
he was incredibly brutal to the Ukrainian people.
Exactly. So when the Germans went into Ukraine, they were initially celebrated by these Ukrainians because they had high expectations. There was this common ritual where they would greet these Germans with salt and something else. But the decision was made to treat them as harshly as possible, kill about 20% of them, if possible. And so this completely turned or limited the ability of the military.
And this was Hitler himself. And of course, Kilzer makes the argument that Martin Bormann was egging on this dark side of Hitler, as well as other Soviet agents. I mentioned Heinz Linge. Heinz Linge was present when Hitler was shown movies of the Ukrainians greeting the German tanks with flowers. And Linge writes in his memoirs that he was in a position during the filming to watch Hitler's face as he watched this. And Hitler made faces. Hitler did not like to see the Ukrainians greeting the German soldiers, which is what you would think. You would be ecstatic. Oh, they love us. They want us. We could. But no, Hitler did not like it. And in no uncertain terms, Linge said he just had this set. He hated Slavs. He hated Jews, he had these these racial prejudice,
Yeah.
which
And
was then the communists could use that because the communists. What's interesting is that the communists assassinated successfully the head the Nazis put in charge of Belarusia
oh, and
in Minsk.
didn't Alfred Rosenberg spend time, the ideological
Rosenberg
guy?
was sort of the boss of the whole
Yeah.
thing, of the whole occupation area.
Yeah,
Yes,
and Rosenberg, he was sort of the ideological guy, and didn't he spend time in Russia? Didn't he have a Russian connection? And
he was born in the Baltic. He was a Baltic German.
okay,
I think
yeah,
he
but
was born in
he
Latvia or
spent. I think
Lithuania.
he even spent some time in Russia for that matter. But I mean,
Yeah, he
Erich,
was educated in Moscow, I think. I think he went to
really,
university in Moscow. Yeah.
and Erich Koch.
Before it became Soviet. Yeah.
Yeah, and Erich Koch ultimately he botched, probably intentionally sabotaged the retreat of the German
Yes.
population when the Soviet army was advancing and all was lost, because all the historians that looked at it knew that an early evacuation could have saved many lives, but he botched it. He expressly forbade people to escape until the very last moment when escape was almost impossible, and either the Russians would get you or the cold weather would get you. And so there's
Yeah.
even my wife's family. Family, they come from that specific area, and they have the memories of that particular escape. So they were grabbing their children, toddlers, babies, and there's like my mother's grandmother, I believe it was. The grandmother was carrying her the youngest child. I think that's my mother-in-law. So grabbing the baby, and there was the smoke everywhere from burning buildings and everything. So they were just escaping on foot with these little carts. And so by the time they got to
And
safety,
this was what, December or January?
I'm not sure yet, but it was crazy cold, and the baby was just covered in soot basically, and everybody thought that the baby wouldn't make it, but ultimately it survived. And then when they came on their escape, they because when you try to escape, you find these different places you can sleep. Usually it's these farmhouses. And there was a farmer family that wanted to buy that baby from them. They were offering them money and for the baby because they desperately wanted one. And they promised them, we will take great care of that baby, and we have land and money and everything's going to turn out fine. And they desperately needed the money, but they kept their child. They kept their baby. So imagine if
The Russians were going to reach that farm too.
Yeah, exactly. And if you run, I mean, if you're on the run, you're on foot, and you just carry what you can, and you desperately need funds, you need resources, and somebody's offering you to buy your baby, to buy your
That's
kid.
terrible.
And
terrible.
and that was the intentionally botched evacuation due to Erich Koch, and he himself had already shipped his Mercedes limousines and some of his artworks, and he was already stashing the stuff on ships to bring it to safety, while everybody else was not allowed to.
He was going to flee to Sweden. Was that where he was going to go?
I think so, and ultimately he was himself forced to steal a bicycle or buy a bicycle and just run and have a fake identity, and ultimately he was caught though.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of those Nazis, even Schellenberg, who fled to Sweden when Sweden had to cough him up later, a lot of the Nazis, they thought that they were safe. They were going to be safe. But yeah, it's so this war in the East, we've got this Hitler invades the Soviet Union, has tremendous success in conquering. And in fact, the fact that Army Group South is delayed in the South actually led to a greater victory, because German Army Group Center passes the flank of the Russian defenses down around Kiev and then just simply swings south. And Hitler had to actually trick his generals because they didn't want to do this. The greatest victory of 1941 was when Hitler tricked his generals by dividing Guderian's command into going south, and they trapped 67 Russian Soviet divisions in the south. Only the 3 cavalry divisions got away because they could ride out on their horses, but everything else was trapped. And it was I think, the biggest battlefield victory where the largest number of troops were captured or destroyed, I think, maybe in history,
Yeah.
because it was a huge force. This is you know 700,000 to 1 million men
Yeah.
were trapped in this pocket, and most of them taken prisoner after the tremendous victories of the North, where they had pocketed the initial Soviet armies near the border with between the Third Reich and the USSR. So this victory gave Germany all of Ukraine, all of the Soviet Union up to Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and the German generals had always been Moscow, Moscow, Moscow. If we take Moscow, the war's over. Just like if you take Paris, right, it's over with France. They think that this is the big thing, and they might have been right. Stalin was evacuated Moscow, and Hitler finally said, well, we're so far ahead, and all of the panzer armies panzer groups were massed in the center to go to Moscow starting in late September, early October.
Oh
And of
God,
course,
yeah.
they got delayed by rain, and they kept
The
advancing.
mud.
And in fact,
Yeah, it was the crazy
it was the
mud.
mud was
Yeah,
it
like with
saved the
Napoleon.
Russians.
Like with
But
Napoleon.
they had, within the first 2-3 weeks, they had destroyed. The Russians had a line of 600,000 troops. They had captured or destroyed half of that line. So they were, even then, with the mud and everything, they were just annihilating the Soviet army.
Do you
And
remember when? Do you remember
yeah,
when the American Lend-Lease program really got into gear, supplying the Soviets? I don't remember exactly when that.
yeah. Well, we were actually supplying them before we got in the war. In fact,
Yeah.
this is brought up. Diana West brings this up, that British military equipment destined for Singapore that would have strengthened Singapore against the Japanese, and American equipment that had been aircraft earmarked for the Philippines, were rushed to the Soviet Union in 1941. This is before Pearl Harbor. So that the Philippines, part of the reason why the Philippines were under strength was they had sent some of this equipment to the Russians. And the same thing with the British. Everything they wanted to send, because Russia was collapsing so fast, everybody thought, if you were, in October 1941, if you were a military analyst, you basically thought the Soviet Union was done. That's how bad
Yeah.
it was. In fact, it was either late October, early November 1941, that Stalin told Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, start looking for some other country that could take us in as refugees, take in the Soviet government, in other words. Where would we go into exile? That's how bad it was. And in fact, Stalin gave an olive branch to Hitler, offered to negotiate a peace deal. And Hitler did not. Hitler was like, no, I got this.
Hmm.
There's no reason to negotiate with Stalin. He probably should have, right?
Yeah.
But there was no reason to negotiate because it was a done deal. And of course, the attack on Moscow was a pincer that was going to come in from both sides. And of course, what happened to that pincer movement? Two things happened. Stalin knew Pearl Harbor because of a spy in Tokyo that he had.
Solga,
Um,
was it, or
Sorga, yes, who was a German diplomat who had been long secretly converted to Marxism, who was working for the Soviet government. He knew he was he was great at sleeping with other diplomats' wives.
hmm
And he was able to, in Tokyo, to find out everything that was going to happen in the Far East. So he found out about Pearl Harbor, but of course, it was Operation Snow. Stalin had tried to set up Pearl Harbor. Stalin had tasked Harry Dexter White, the deputy head of the Treasury, who was really operating the
Yeah.
Treasury, to provoke the Japanese in this cable that would make them, give the Japanese, not only humiliate them, but give them no room to kind of save face, which you don't want to necessarily do with the Japanese. And this created an argument within the Japanese military structures where suddenly the U.S. was embargoing Japan because of its occupation of French Indochina in 1941, embargoing it of oil and, of course, metal things that Japan needed. There's no oil in Japan. There's a little bit in Manchuria, but most of the oil Japan got was from Indonesia, which was below the Philippines, and they would have to travel past the Philippines where the Americans had air forces and an army under Douglas MacArthur, and of course that would cut Japan. So the Japanese had to take the Philippines, which means in order to make the way free, and that meant, well, we might as well attack the American fleet in Hawaii. And that was all set up, and it was Operation Snow. There's a book called Operation Snow. I recommend everybody to read it. And why? Because what was Stalin's greatest fear? That army, the Kuomintang army in Manchuria, would invade Siberia if he pulled those Siberian troops back to Moscow. Well, once he knew that this attack was going to happen, that Japan was going against the U.S., he could pull those troops to Moscow. So Moscow was beginning to receive reinforcements from the Far East of these divisions that were fresh, that were sitting there. And also on December 5th, the temperatures dropped. They had record cold temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero in the front around Moscow on December the 5th. And that was so cold, the Germans had not winterized their gun oil or their petroleum. So that meant their equipment was disabled by the cold. The cold was, not only did it cause 70,000 frostbite injuries in the armies that were attacking Moscow, it destroyed their equipment.
Yeah, and also the whole equipment was not winter ready for those kind of temperatures. The clothing, it took a while. I mean, a while until the troops were issued this. They called it the Charkov parka. This was a long jacket with fur, I think, on the inside as well. I think it was rabbit fur. And it took a while for soldiers to actually get this. And many men were lost because the very air was killing you. So if anything, if any part of your body got exposed, this was extremely dangerous. And the diesel fuel, the oil, none of the equipment was really suited for that kind of an environment.
And gun oil is sensitive to temperatures too. You have to have oil in a gun to get it to function properly, to reload and fire. Otherwise, it'll jam up. So you have to have gun oil. Well, if the gun oil itself is compromised at those temperatures, guess what's going to happen when you go to fire it? And also, some of the metal becomes more brittle. That is, its strength weakens. So you have howitzers that can explode.
Yeah,
you have even machine guns. Yeah, that
sometimes
don't work.
Even when you, for example, when you install the barrel of an AK-47 rifle, professional gun makers, they will actually freeze the barrel because it would become, I think, slightly smaller. Then they could install the barrel. But imagine if all of your equipment is in that condition, and also the general armaments. I mean, Hitler was demanding that the soldiers were using these old style bolt action rifles because that's what Hitler knew. He hated modern technology in certain areas. Sometimes he thought modern weapons technologies were Jewish science. You know, he didn't like certain technologies, and he would issue these old style rifles when they had a new assault rifle ready to be mass produced. I think it was the Sturmgewehr 44, the 44. This was pretty much like any modern assault rifle. It had an intermediary sized bullet. So it was not a regular pistol bullet, but it was not as big as the average rifle bullet. So you could carry a sizable amount of ammo, and you would have the semi-automatic fire, and you could use this rifle in distances of up to, I think, 400 meters. This was also not implemented at that stage. No strategic bomber force. And so this became a nightmare on so many levels. And even in the winter of 1942, the command structure of the Nazis became even more silly, even more dysfunctional, because at that point, you could only get access to Hitler through Bormann, Keitel, and Lammers. And the way this worked was you had to submit this request to talk to Hitler, and so Bormann, Keitel, and Lammers would just get the information about what this general or whatever wanted. They would come up with a way of telling a story to Hitler. They would pre-prepare Hitler. They would already make the decision with Hitler, and then the talk would actually take place. So information was flowing to Hitler through these guys, and it would flow from Hitler mostly through these guys. And we know almost for certain that Bormann was a traitor with the Soviets. Bormann was probably the agent codenamed Werther. And the way this worked was there were several of these high-ranking moles, and they would send the material to another person. He would send it to another person. This was it ended up with a man called Rado, and he had these radio operators that would then radio that stuff to the Soviets. And the material that Rado received was sorted into categories. So, for example, that information came from Agent Werther. That information came from the other agent, and then so on and so forth. So, this was a not just about stealing information, extracting information out of Germany, especially about the war, where the troops are going to be, how much ammo they have, how much reserves they had. Not just taking taking this information out of Germany and bringing it to Russia, but they would also bring influence from Russia to Hitler. And
Yes.
it was
Yeah,
really rare.
Bormann was influencing Hitler in a demonic way, and Hitler already had his demonic side, of course, as we know. And so it wasn't that difficult to do provocations that would get Hitler to do things that were really against Germany's interest, but of course appealed to this crazy murderous side of Hitler. I should now that we're discussing this winter of late 41, 42. Well, it's autumn of 42 when this winter strike happens. This horrible first winter. A very disastrous thing for Germany happened in addition to this, and that was that damaged, in terms of the German strategic efficiency, damaged the German generals who, had operational art of war, had the skill, had shown themselves to be very skillful warriors, versus Hitler, because a panic happened among the German generals. Brockisch, Halder, the commander of Army Group Center, General von Bock had a heart attack or a nervous breakdown. A lot of the German generals they were exhausted physically from the campaign into Russia already, because they are going at this massive pace. As you say, speed is of the essence. So these guys are not sleeping. They're putting in tremendously long hours. And then this winter strike, this unexpected 40 below weather that's killing men and wounding them and making the equipment not work. They were in such a panic. They were telling Hitler, we have to retreat all the way back to, some of them said, all the way back to Poland. Right, we've got to get out of Russia because we're all going to die. It's like they had the syndrome of Napoleon. They're all reading that famous book by that one of Napoleon's officers. I read it years ago. I can't remember his name now, but it was the account of Napoleon's army being caught in this premature winter, where the horses got frostbite. They then the men had to pull the carts and so on. They had this vision of the destruction of the Grand Army was going to happen to the Wehrmacht, right? And Hitler was correct in this one thing. You don't retreat. You dig in, you stay in place. If you retreat, it turns into a rout. Hitler had this one piece of understanding of prudence, that if you retreat, you'll have more frostbite casualties. You will lose your positions. The Russians will kill you on the retreat. Dig in, hold, they did withdraw in Army Group Center. They had to withdraw into where they could actually get better supplies and the men could get warm. But Hitler said it's the stand order, stand fast. And Hitler proved to be right. The front held. A disaster didn't happen. The German casualties weren't greater in December than, in fact, it was a lower than average casualty rate because the retreats were judicious, and the even fired General von Rundstedt for giving up the city of Rostov and falling back to what he thought was a more defensible position. And Rundstedt was probably correct. Of course, he brought Rundstedt back later, but because he was an old World War I general that he was like in his 70s. But this embarrassed the generals, Halder and Brockisch. These generals, now they had egg on their face because they panicked, and Hitler held the army together. So that meant that Hitler now could run the war without the military professionals sort of having the final say on things, so that Hitler could get his way on the overall strategy. And this would prove disastrous in 1942 when Germany renewed the offensive. I mean, would you basically agree with this?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean this, I mean, even before the Operation Barbarossa started, Hitler would take certain generals out of circulation. He would retire them. He would change things around, and he would continuously change personnel, even though he oftentimes didn't even know these generals that well. So,
and he would, by the way, he would bribe generals. He would give them estates. He would give them
yeah,
huge cash rewards. This is something that has not been discussed generally about World War II history, is that Hitler would win the basic loyalty of these generals by making them super wealthy. People like
yeah,
Guderian, generals. These generals were given, land and money,
yeah, and of
to
course,
keep
yeah,
them
I mean, of
loyal to
course,
Hitler.
I mean, there's also another element, I think, to this, and this is also something we see in Russia now with the Ukraine war.
Yes,
The families of the generals, because they usually have multiple children, they have wives, and they can either be, benefit from the bribes. They live in bigger houses and the children have bigger careers. But it also goes the other way. If you lose Hitler's trust, this could have disastrous consequences. So again, it's this limiting of decision power, limiting of influence, and everything at some point ran through Bormann, Keitel, and Lammers. And Keitel, of course, Keitel always did what Hitler told him. He was the one who would just trash other generals and agree with Hitler over and over and over again to the very end. And he's also a character that needs to be looked at more closely in hindsight,
he
because
was hanged at Nuremberg.
yeah,
Keitel.
but we need to look further into this guy and his connections, because there was always, I mean, people talk about the assassination attempts against Hitler and how they failed and so on and so forth, but there was always the option of killing Hitler, because
Yes.
Bormann basically was responsible for Hitler's surroundings. So the service personnel, the personal assistants, the places Hitler lived in, there was always a way to poison Hitler. There was always a way to kill Hitler, even subtly. If you poisoned Hitler just a bit, he would be unable to continue his work, so he would have to hand over command to somebody else. So,
And think about it. Stalin's agent, Bormann was Stalin's agent. If Stalin had wanted to kill Hitler, there he had Bormann
yeah,
as an agent. He could have done it, couldn't he?
exactly. Now there's I have this book over there. I recently reread it. It's from a German guy. He was, I think, in the defense the defense ministry during the Cold War, and he wrote this book under a pseudonym about energy weapons related to the Havana, the Russian energy weapons, the Havana
Oh,
syndrome,
yes.
the Moscow signal. And so he was writing this in the mid 80s, and he was interested in the Nazis, and he suspected that, for various reasons, he suspected then that some form of radiation was used against Hitler. And of course, suspects like Bormann and others, especially Bormann, because or even Albert Speer himself, because these people were responsible for the buildings that Hitler lived in, his personal quarters. They could hide stuff in the walls. They could hide microphones. They could hide maybe something that emits radiation. They could do whatever they wanted. And also, this is something that that people misunderstand, I think, to this very day. When we talk about Hitler's doctors, right? Because they had to give him amphetamines, they had to give him all kinds of stuff because Hitler had such ADHD, he couldn't focus really before the war as much. But when he was on these amphetamines, something that you would give to a person today with ADHD, Hitler was able to work all these hours. And so people looked at the official documents that survived of Hitler's doctors, and they were not noticing anything too unusual. But all these people said that there was no clear record keeping of any of this. So
Dr. Morell was not Dr. Morell, who gave him his syphilis treatment, his little pills. There was something wrong with him, wasn't there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it wasn't just him. It was another major doctor as well that Speer was describing. And these historians, when they looked at it later, they assumed, they expected Hitler's fluctuating health. They expected it to correspond to how the war went. So they imagined if the war was going well or something turned out to be better, they expected Hitler to be more healthy. And when the war was not going well, they expected Hitler to be miserable, but it was exactly the opposite. It was exactly the opposite. Whenever something went well, Hitler was feeling terrible, like he was about to die. You know, his digestive system, anything, it was completely out of whack.
Oh yeah, he had terrible digestive, which is also a syphilis symptom. He had terrible digestive problems.
So for example, this German author, his pseudonym was Paul Chartes, but he wasn't the only one. Some people suspected that some agents, some assets were manipulating Hitler's health to influence his decisions, because we know Hitler was an occultist. Hitler was having all these weird ideas that, you know, he could that sort of these forces were talking to him and giving him inspiration, and probably somebody had the opportunity at least to influence Hitler that way. So when Hitler was making a certain decision, he would immediately feel better. So he may have believed that fate was on his side again because he made that particular decision. So Hitler could have been killed many, many times over. And if the British had actually given a public statement about not intervening in Germany, if there's a civil war breaking out within Germany, things could have gone very much in a different way.
Oh yes, very. In fact, Stalin had a lot. Still, even in the midst of the war, he had a lot riding on Hitler. Hitler was his guy. He was the ideal enemy for Stalin because there was Bormann right at Hitler's elbow, manipulating everything so that Stalin could not only win the war, but he could get to Berlin. He could get to the heart of Europe.
Yeah.
And get the lion's share of the spoils.
I suspect that the Russians were able to recruit Martin Bormann through some aristocratic intermediaries. So you have these aristocrats who are Russian Soviet agents, and these middlemen probably recruited Martin Bormann early on because Bormann was a young soldier in World War I. He was almost too young at all to join the war. He didn't see any fighting, I believe, because of his age. And then he got hooked into the aristocracy in Mecklenburg because those were his commanding officers. And then he rose up in this early Nazi system. He joined early. He was in a Freikorps battle group. This was sort of an irregular, extreme right-wing group that was fighting, communists that wanted to have their mini republics. And so he was rising up in the Nazi system so fast. And
he was the deputy of Rudolf Hess.
Yeah, he was, people in public oftentimes didn't even know him at all, or they didn't know a whole lot about him. They always expected Hitler to make all these decisions, but they didn't know much about Bormann. So I think some of this Mecklenburg aristocracy, was recruited by the Soviet intelligence, and they were able to recruit people like Bormann, because that's the pipeline you would use. I mean, from the Russian perspective, that's a perfect way of recruiting people, because the middlemen, they look perfectly German. They come from old families. They look perfectly German. So a guy like Bormann would trust them, and that became sort of a massive problem. And so Keitel, who was heading the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, like the what do you call it in English? Sort of the
OKW.
Yeah, it was the leadership of the army. Wilhelm
And then
Keitel.
there was the Oberkommando Heeresgruppe.
Yeah.
OKH.
Wilhelm Keitel. He came from a very simple background, and he was marrying into a family that owned sort of a larger property in Hanover. And Hanover, of course, was the origin of the modern British kings. And Keitel was always agreeing with Hitler. And Keitel was working on these other generals as well. So I think we should look into Keitel. We should look into Hanover, because if Soviet agents or Russian agents got into these places, Mecklenburg, Hanover, that's, of course, a disaster of historic proportions. Because the Nazis to a large degree understood counterintelligence as killing Jews, right? So if you kill the Jews, because they believed Jews had this magical ability for subversion and wrecking empires, so they thought killing Jews equals counterintelligence. So by killing all these Jews, they thought they've done a really spectacular job at counterintelligence.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if Soviet agents got into Hanover and Mecklenburg and Schleswig-Holstein, you're screwed. I mean, you're completely screwed.
They wouldn't even notice it. Yeah, no. I should mention Himmler's Posen speech, which they have the original copy of the tape recording of it, which is I think it's the only recording of a Nazi official admitting the Holocaust, right? Yeah. And it's at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, if people want to go there. But you can actually listen to it online. I believe that there's versions of it you can listen to on. But it was a speech. I think it was given in September of 1944, and this is what Himmler says in the speech. He basically says the same thing you just said, that if they had not rounded up the Jews, if they had not eliminated the Jews or done this Holocaust, they didn't use that word. He said if they hadn't done it, the Jews would have done the same thing to Nazi Germany that they did, allegedly, the stab in the back in World War I.
Yeah,
so that Germany wouldn't have been able to stand up and hold up, right?
And also this traditional conspiracy idea that Jewish intelligence circles, the elders of Zion,
right,
that these Jews had taken over Britain and taken control away from the old rulers. And this, I mean, even before the Nazis were around, this was kind of the prevailing idea. This is also what you saw in modern conspiracy literature. Apparently, Jews have these magical subversive abilities. They can almost perform miracles. And so you cannot just deport them. You cannot just round them up and put them in these ghettos. You have to physically eliminate them to provide this level of counterintelligence. Even Canaris, the intelligence head, Canaris, he even said, our armies, they will bleed to death on the icy plains of Russia, and after 2 years there would be nothing left. That was the idea that Canaris had about this, and
Canaris was always working to try to bring an early end to the war if he could, working against Hitler.
And he covered he covered his own he covered his own butt when he assembled, or had a report assembled before Operation Barbarossa, where he estimated the Russian capabilities and the problems of the Germans, because if this all went wrong, he didn't want to be held responsible. He could point to his earlier report that was on record and say, "I told you so."
Yes, yeah. Canaris was very smart. He was one of the most brilliant. In fact, the Soviets were more afraid of him. Soviet intelligence was more afraid of him than any other leader of intelligence in the world. Why? Because they knew that he wanted this Germany to make peace with the Allies and wanted to not be defeated by the Soviet Union. And if he brought an early end to the war, then the Soviet armies wouldn't make it to Berlin and Vienna.
Yeah, and there's this
And
one
and that was, yeah.
there was this one episode in 1943. That was a very important year in the war. This is when things started to shift tremendously. So in 43, Canaris had a secret meeting in Istanbul. He was meeting the American diplomat George Earle, who was a friend of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
And so he was making all these kinds of suggestions. Hitler was supposed to be killed or retired, and so these remaining leaders in Germany, they were intended to make peace and end the war and all that. So Earl was typing up this report about that secret meeting, sent the report to the White House, but there was no answer. So what do you think about Roosevelt's role in this?
Well, Roosevelt had the same problem Hitler had. His health was bad, like Hitler's health. And the man that was around him all the time, Harry Hopkins, I think it's credible that Harry Hopkins was a Soviet agent. And Diana West makes the case in her book, American Betrayal. And there was a researcher named Marx, not M-A-R-X, but another Marx, who did a study of who the Agent 19, we had the decrypts that we had broken the Soviet code. I think it was a captured Finnish code book was given to us, and we were able to decipher the Soviet encryption from their embassy in Washington. And so we were able to read their intelligence cables. And we had, it was a matter of just, it was a mass of the stuff we'd collected that we hadn't all decoded. But in 1943, it was determined that now the White House staff during the war, there were thousands of people working for the White House, but it was determined there were 324 Soviet agents in the Roosevelt White House. Okay, and one of them was Agent 19, and Marx had done an analysis of what they had the cables with the information. Where could this information have come from? And some of it was from a Allied meeting in Canada that Roosevelt attended. But the only person that could have been American who was there for that information was Harry Hopkins, was at Roosevelt's elbow. So Marx determined Hopkins had to be Agent 19. And his analysis, there were later other historians claimed that Marx died, unfortunately, of a heart attack. I think it was a heart attack or a stroke suddenly, but there were people who claimed that just before his death, he recanted this, which is completely false. He never did recant it, and Diana West has kind of shown this, along with some M. Stanton Evans, who wrote was a co-author of the book Stalin's Secret Agents, and of course wrote the book on McCarthy, blacklisted by history. But what's fascinating is that Harry Hopkins's role as co-president, which the press described him as a co-president with Roosevelt, was extremely important to Stalin. Hopkins was the first American representative of Roosevelt to go and meet with Stalin and make all these promises to him, meet with Churchill, develop the Lend-Lease. Hopkins was this ultimate troubleshooter with the prestige of speaking for the president. And of course, Hopkins was caught by Hoover helping the Soviets with espionage. It was in 1943, I believe was the year, the FBI had discovered the Soviets had penetrated part of the Manhattan Project, which was the project to make the American atomic bomb. They were running part of it. Part of it was running out of UC Berkeley, and they had detected there were Soviet agents that were in this Berkeley part of it, and that they were onto them. And J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI had called Roosevelt at the White House, but he got Harry Hopkins on the phone because Harry lived
Uh-oh.
at the White House. And he said, look, tell he said, the president, he's not feeling well. He can't come to the phone. So Hoover said, look, tell the president we found these Soviet agents infiltrating UC Berkeley, the Manhattan Project. It's very important. He needs to know. So what did Hopkins do? And this is well documented. He goes to the Soviet embassy and tells them that the FBI has
Oh.
found out about them. And of course, he's confronted.
Oh.
Hoover is furious. There's an extant letter from Hoover, basically calling him out, calling Harry Hopkins out on the carpet about this, and saying that he ran to the Soviet embassy with this. This is a breach of, and Roosevelt defends Hopkins because Hopkins said, "Look, the Soviets are our allies. They need to know that they
Yeah.
made this mistake." Right?
Oh
Is
boy.
that crazy?
Oh
It's
boy.
crazy.
So this was then the situation. The front line was 3,000 kilometers long. What's that in miles? That's like
2,000
2,300 miles.
miles. It's
Yeah,
2,000 miles. Yeah, it's
roughly
a
2,000
2,000 mile
miles.
front line. Yeah, running from
Um,
Leningrad on the Gulf of
yeah,
Finland all the way down to the Sea of Azov in
and
the south, which is off the
the
Black Sea.
the supply lines became also increasingly large, and even when Barbarossa started, the railway system was not good enough. They couldn't even process all these trains, and so
Well, the problem was the Russians ran a different gauge of railroad. They had
yeah,
wide gauge
yeah.
railroad tracks, so the Germans had to literally replace all the rail tracks with the narrower European gauge tracks.
So yeah, so then of course the infamous situation with Stalingrad that became a disaster. The Sixth German Army was almost enclosed. 220,000 men, 100 tanks, 1,800 large guns, 10,000 other vehicles. Hitler wanted them to continue fighting, and almost the entire battle group, what do you call it, Heeresgruppe A, was about to be encircled, and then
And yeah,
ultimately
we should explain how Hitler did this disaster, how he made love to this disaster. Because he had been right the previous winter in holding the line, he ended up being able to make the whole plan for 1942. And Hitler thought he wanted the oil in Baku, in the Caspian oil. And so he had this idea of creating another army group, Army Group A, which had a lot of panzers in it. It was going to go all the way across that desert north of the Caucasus, this just open prairie, basically, go across that and invade the Caucasus and get all the way to Baku and get that oil for the Third Reich. That was crazy. That was they called it a
hmm,
safari. They made the joke. And at the same time, Army Group South, 6th Army leading the way, was going to go to Stalingrad, and which was just on the west bank of the Volga River, and secure that as the main, it's sort of like a main hub, a rail hub, decisive for controlling that part of Russia, to control that, and then to use the Don River, which the Don comes close to the Volga near Stalingrad, but then it veers to the northwest to Voronezh, and to make a line there to protect the flank of this whole thing. So this was the plan. They were going to have this tremendous advance. They were going to take this oil. It was crazy
hmm.
operationally. Any of the, Halder or Barakish, any of the old generals would have looked at this and said, this is insane, because you are stretching the German line to go way, way south for that oil, with a whole army group that, instead of fighting the Russians and destroying Russian armies all summer, is doing nothing but marching all summer, doing nothing, because the Russians just basically had light defenses in the south and the Caucasus, and they just basically withdrew.
Yeah,
And then
the
you are concentrating on Stalingrad, an urban area, to capture you're over concentrated here, you're under concentrated, you're actually having Romanian armies, two Romanian armies protecting the flank of this huge concentration of 6th Army on Stalingrad, and you've got your most powerful army group doing nothing but marching, marching, marching. So this is a recipe for the defeat of the German army
Yeah.
in late 1942.
Yeah.
Just to set that up.
Sixth Army capitulated, and of course,
And on
the urban.
February, what was it, February 3rd or 4th, 1943?
I don't remember that date. It's just
Yeah.
the nightmarish urban warfare that took place, and I would suggest people grab a good book about Stalingrad and this level of urban warfare, because I mean, many militaries nowadays, they expect urban warfare to become a much bigger factor. Ultimately, it was a situation where tunnels were dug. People were making holes and punching holes into walls, and they were creating all this almost like a rat's nest. They called it a rat. They call it rat warfare because it was like a rat's nest, and people were using flamethrowers to clear these tunnels and to move into the next building, or to move into the next room using flamethrowers. It was just a miserable, super miserable type of warfare, and the average soldier, of course, didn't last that long. Some of these tanks, they couldn't fire that high up to catch all of the people that are in the building or on top of a building. So it was just problems with the equipment all around, and just the amount of ammo that was used was also draining German supplies, and at some point, of course, the German main territory was bombed by the Allies. The British. The British bombings, so they constantly had to shift production around, and some of these facilities that were hit, they were processing ball bearings. So without ball bearings, you have no war making capacity. This became a nightmare at home when these facilities had to be shifted and things had to be moved underground, and just to supply these troops. Now, constantly in Russia, the supplies were never enough to to conduct a proper operation, because the generals would always estimate what was needed. They needed X amount of this and X amount of that, but only a fraction of that could be provided because of these long supply lines and problems associated with that. Then, of course, there was the humongous Battle of Kursk. This was when 2 million soldiers battled each other. I mean, that sheer number is just mind-boggling. There used to be a time when an entire force was just, 1 million each, but or in that dimension. But this was a single battle where 2 million soldiers were fighting each other.
Yeah, we should mention that's later in 43. We should mention the other disaster that happened in 43, which was really the equal to Stalingrad, and people don't talk about it much. It's when the Germans lost their army in Tunisia, which was always a strange thing. Rommel had lost the Battle of El Alamein and had a 2,000-mile retreat back from Egypt, where El Alamein is.
Italy, the Alps.
And he had to retreat all the way back to Tunisia, where Operation Torch in November 1942, the Americans and the British invaded French Northwest Africa, which was part of Vichy France, and they captured it. They landed at Algiers and in Morocco. And the Germans at the same time came straight into Tunisia, which was close to Italy, close to Sicily. And when Rommel retreated from Egypt through Libya, they gave up Libya, which was the Italian colony in Africa that really caused the Afrika Korps to come in and to rescue the Italians after Graziani's army was destroyed in late 1940. They created this huge army in Tunisia. And of course, the Battle of Kasserine Pass was Rommel's last famous battle, where the American 2nd Corps was defeated by Rommel decisively. But then Rommel left Tunisia. Avantama, I think, was left in charge, but they had loaded it up with all these troops. They had a whole panzer army now down in Tunisia, but they had no way of. The Allies had such air and naval superiority. The Germans couldn't keep it supplied, and so they lost at the same time. This was in May of 1943. So in February you have Sixth Army defeat the biggest army in the German armed forces, and then you have the Tunisian army with the Italians and everything that's lost. The amount of people they could evacuate was just, I think, a fraction of what they had. So maybe you could comment on that. A double disaster in the first half of 1943.
Well, people have always wondered why not much effort, or why such a limited effort was made in the Mediterranean, the entire Mediterranean area, because the British had their strongholds there, and also the supply situation became an issue because of these Bletchley Park ultra intercepts decoding the Enigma. So these ships supplying fuel for Rommel's tanks, these ships were sunk quite often. And
The
so,
British had an island between
yeah,
Italy and the main center uh, in Libya was Tripoli,
yeah.
and they had Malta was like in between Sicily and Tripoli, and they could use planes and ships to intercept the Italian convoys,
Yeah.
and this devastated Rommel's supply line was not reliable.
And also, there's another element to this. People sort of remember that after World War II, there was a very large communist movement in Italy. It was already there, of course,
Yes,
during the
yes.
war, before the war. And so, especially during the Cold War, the Italian Communist Party was, I think, one of the biggest communist parties in
It
the
it
world.
was the biggest communist party in
Yeah.
the West, in NATO.
It
Yeah.
dwarfed anything else that we saw, and so these, of course, these communists then tried to gain political power because they had been involved in certain operations. But I think not enough research has been done on the role of the communists in Italy, because Rommel was relying on Italy to a large degree, and with these. With these Italians, some of them had a connection to Britain, and some of them, there was just this mass communist infiltration of Italy, and this was not properly addressed. And
Yeah.
so
Also,
this
the
whole
Italian officer corps and the royal family were British connected or had British sympathies.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
entire Mediterranean region was, of course, then a mess, for the Germans, and in this whole effort, the goal was always to cut off the British, just to get rid of the British in that whole area. And at some point, the British even anticipated they might have to leave some of these areas that they were involved or have been involved in for so long. But ultimately, this came to nothing, and Rommel had to make this crazy retreat going through Italy, through the Alps, and this is even when the power changed, the leadership changed in Italy, and Italy flipped ultimately. So his
Yeah,
supposed
it was the
helpers became
invasion of
enemies.
Sicily. Yeah, in July 1943, the U.S. and Britain invaded Sicily. The Eighth Army and the U.S. Seventh Army landed, and it was the U.S. Seventh Army was led by Patton, of course, and the Eighth Army by Montgomery. And they had, after the German surrender in Tunisia, Sicily was logically next. And what happened was, and Hitler had enough knowledge of what was going on in Italy, he knew that if the island of Sicily fell, Mussolini's rule over Italy was imperiled. And of course, that's what exactly happened. The fascist council itself deposed Mussolini after the defeat in Sicily, and the king announced, the king of Italy. They also had a king aside from Mussolini. They basically started to negotiate to surrender and to flip sides. And Hitler had an operation. You may remember the name of the operation, to have enough German units positioned in Italy to be able to intern the entire Italian army overnight, in a fortnight, which is what they were able to successfully do. And of course, take them to prisoner of war camps in Austria. I think in Austria, maybe it was in Germany.
Yeah, and so and of course the Americans, they had the American intelligence, they had connection to some of these crime families in Sicily, because they knew all
Yes,
the ports, they knew the territory, they had some sort of control. But during the Cold War, these crime families, they also seem to have Russian connections, and that
the
is
Russians went
still
out to
to this day.
control organized
Yeah,
crime. Yeah, they went out to control it in the 1950s. They studied it and said organized crime is a key to political intelligence in the West. So they decided to
yeah,
infiltrate the mafias, to where now the Italian Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry into the Mafia told, this is in David Remnick's Pulitzer Prize winning book Lenin's Tomb, told David Remnick that Russia was now the capital of international organized crime, coordinating the three major Italian mafias.
yeah.
So yeah, but in that time in World War II, the mafia was helping America, especially with
Yeah,
Sicily
and
being
also
the first target.
after the war, this some of these Italians, they increased their activities in the United States, and of course, if there's a Soviet connection to that, that means now you not just have Italian organized crime in the United States, but you also have Russian infiltration in the United States, and of course, this goes into the FBI's history, Hoover, and the attempts to deal with this whole situation with the mafia. In So when everything was going downhill for the Germans, Hitler was demanding that Prince Philip of Hessen come to the headquarters together with Princess Mafalda, who was the daughter of the Italian king. And Mafalda had sent encrypted communications to Italy, and the Italian king had Mussolini arrested, and so Hitler was sending both of them, or he had the intention of sending both of them to a concentration camp. So this is sort of the late stage of that game, when he was becoming more aware that he was surrounded by enemies, traitors, or just people who wanted a different outcome. There were people who wanted to make peace with the Russians and keep some of the territorial gains and just find some sort of a deal before the Americans land again, with in the Normandy, the D-Day invasion, Operation
And of
Overlord.
course, before that, the first landing on the continent of Europe by the Allies was, of course, Salerno, which happened after this was, Montgomery's Eighth Army had crossed at Messina the Straits from Sicily onto Italy, and he was slowly, it's very narrow boot of land, he was slowly coming up there, but the British and Americans launched an amphibious invasion of Salerno, and it was a very touch and go battle. The Germans almost won that battle because of certain mistakes that the Allies made, but they were learning, and it was their second major amphibious operation in the European, or the European theater, Mediterranean actually. So yeah, so we're getting into 1943, where Germany's on the defensive, and you mentioned the Battle of Kursk, which of course happened in July of 1943, and we should maybe discuss Prokhorovka and the what John Mosher says happened there, which is interesting, different, because I think the Russians have mischaracterized the Battle of Kursk. I think Mosher is correct. They've tried to make it sound like a victory when they were really had their face smashed in. They really suffered a horrible setback there, but because of what happened in Italy, Hitler had to withdraw his best super divisions, SS Panzers and others, to go to Italy, because you can't just hop on a train and go. It's really an ordeal to
Mm-hmm.
move a Panzer division all the way from the Russian front to Italy. And so they knew they needed armies, and they needed really good troops in Italy to face the British and Americans, because the British and Americans were qualitatively better troops than the Soviet troops. And
Yeah.
so they needed these divisions. So maybe we should start with that next week, and then we can finish the war, because
And
we've got,
the aftermath of
and
the
the
war.
aftermath. Yeah, because we got we just got through the middle of World War II, and we're almost done 3 hours here. So we want to keep it below
And
3 hours.
we haven't talked about China yet because China was a hot zone at the
Yeah.
time. Yeah, and
Yeah, well, we might need to do another show about the Pacific and how the communists got control of China after the war in the wake of the way the Pacific War was managed. So we should talk about that because how did the communists win so much? I mean, Lenin's idea, remember, was there was going to be this
mm,
second war and we were going to control Europe and they could get control of the Far East.
which they
See,
did to
and
some
they did.
degree.
They
Yeah.
got China.
Mm.
Yeah, out of it, not right away, but they arranged everything so they did. And we should probably talk about the mystery of the Battle of the Bulge at the end of the war, the mystery of General George Marshall, who later was accused by Senator Joseph McCarthy of. He didn't actually accuse him, but he indirectly suggested there was something wrong with George Marshall, that George Marshall had helped the communists. And I think there's some more merit to Joseph McCarthy's uh, bill of indictment against Marshall than we would think, especially when it comes to Operation Olympic against Japan and the Battle of the Bulge. So we can cover that next week too, because it's at the end of the war that Stalin's control of Hitler's government, and we should also talk about Schellenberg's memoir about how there's a civil war going on within the elite of the Third Reich between the Soviet agents and the ones that want to go with the West within
Yeah.
Germany, that this was already developing in the Third Reich. And that you had the same thing in the United States with the massive infiltration of the Roosevelt administration by the communists, which was revealed then after the war by people like the House Un-American Activities Committee and the testimony of against Elder Hiss by Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley and Louis Boudin's and many others, which led to the Senate hearings, McCarthy Senate hearings, and the Army McCarthy hearings. So all of that is connected to the war and what happened during the war.
Exactly. Now, this of course, then the aftermath of the war leads us also into China. That leads into, of course, then the Korean War, which was a major incident, and then we're gonna move forward through the Cold War period. Go through Vietnam and all the other major conflicts. And
a lot of myths and legends there to break down, because a lot of the things people think about these wars are just not true.
Yeah, and so this is gonna be the next episodes, and at some point we can just fluctuate between central topics or just current events, current stories, that came up during the week. There's all sorts of important things that need to be said, and also it also integrates very well, because when we look at the situation now, we may have a world war pretty soon. People should really know about the Second World War and the First World War and the wars, for example, in Korea and Vietnam, because this is all very important. Now we see some more mainstream productions. I think there's a docu-series now on Netflix that's fairly new about the Cold War. The mainstream will do more about this, but it's never going to be really deep. It's never going to be really about the intelligence level of it, which is almost a decisive factor when it comes to these things. And people have talked about the tanks of World War II and the airplanes and just the ideology of it, but they rarely really touch on the intelligence level. And you made some really important comparisons between the Russian planning back then and the Russians' plans now. They plan ahead. They envision these conflicts and make these necessary preparations, especially on the information front, because they wouldn't go to war if they didn't have all this propaganda in place. They are literally inside people's heads, even in conservative heads. They've managed to do that, and this was something we also presented in this show today, this was also the case with Germany when all these right-wingers had ideas in their heads. Some of these ideas came directly from Russia, like the Protocols of Zion.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, the tools of intelligence and strategy, they go together. And the Russians are the masters of psychological warfare and information warfare and perceptions management. If you can manage your enemy's perceptions, you can misguide his strategy, and you can do all kinds of things. You can divert his attention away from what he needs to be paying attention to. You can get him to attack objects that are not necessary. You can bring other parties into the war. You can delay your own entry into a war so you're stronger. This is what Stalin did both in the European theater and especially in the Pacific. We'll see that Stalin maintained his non-aggression pact with Japan clear up to 1945.
Yeah.
And then stabbed Japan in the back by invading suddenly Manchuria in August of 1945. So it's about the same time the atomic bombs were being dropped on Japan. So these are all things we will cover, and how the Russians really take advantage. Where they win is intelligence, diplomacy, and despite their military bungling, they make it work. They basically leverage that to make battlefield victories too.
Yeah, yeah, and also when we talk about the 1940s and then the 1950s, also the role of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was a supreme Allied commander, the Asian theater, and he was involved in bungling China, definitely when the nationalists were no longer supported and the Chinese took over. And then, of course, the other things that Lord Louis Mountbatten did, and we know now about Mountbatten's Soviet contacts, and we know about his Soviet leanings and the ideas that he had. And he was the guy who presented his candidate, Baron Hastings Ismay, as the first Secretary General of NATO. And now we are left with a NATO organization that has had its own infiltration problem. Now, the Russians, they always tell you that NATO is a Nazi-like behemoth, but it's very far from that. It's just a situation that persists to this very day, and we feel that in Europe, especially when Germany barely has an army to speak of. The French have large issues with their military. And this is now in the year 2024 when the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans could strike at multiple points simultaneously.
Yeah, we're in a pre-war. A lot of people believe we're in a pre-war World War situation now with China and Russia, and I think that may be exactly correct, because they've been, just like they prepared 20 years in advance with Lenin's strategy for World War II, the Second Imperialist War. They have been preparing for a long time with their long-range strategy and their deception strategies and their what you would call their culture war. They've been preparing this for a long time against the West. So everybody, thank you for joining us for this part 2 of World War II. Part 3 next week. I am Jeff Nyquist. I'm in the United States. Alex Benesch has been my co-host. He's in Germany, and it's kind of nice to have somebody who is an American and a German to discuss World War II, and we hope you'll join us next week.